is early. Maybe we should give people a pass on turning on their cameras.
I
And
don't think so,
we
man.
can show
If
some
yours is
mercy.
on,
I don't want to be like a totalitarian professor, you know.
yes, you do.
Uh, I
We
know. Well,
all
that's
do.
actually a very Seminar 17 motif, given that all of the left-wing Marxists, you know what they called Lacan at the time, right?
Master? No, I forget
No, a
what.
Stalinist.
Oh, no shit.
Of course, that was one of Deleuze and Guattari's
That's one of the
conceptions.
nicest names that you can get.
Yeah. Back then a
Exactly.
Stalinist was like calling somebody brother or sister?
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
that was the whole thing is that they did this experimental university and they wanted to see how Lacan might fit into it. And he ended up, for this libertarian students, being far too authoritarian, apparently. And
Yeah.
that actually is exactly why you have all of those meditations on the absence of shame. So if the Vincennes University is a petri dish for the institutional expression of the spirit of 68 in all of its anarchism,
hmm
Lacan's teachings still retained authoritarian Stalinism, according to Deleuze and Guattari,
I
right?
get that.
Which I think is a very kind of silly or maybe hyperbolic thing. We can talk about that maybe at some point because I've always been so deeply fascinated by what Lacan has to say about how 68 perpetuates a culture of shamelessness or sort
Mm.
of expresses a culture of shamelessness. Because I've always thought that that was so intimately connected to contemporary political phenomena, even like Trumpism, which seems to thrive off of shamelessness.
That's a
And that's
very interesting move. Shame has been coming up recently.
yeah.
It's like a
What's a
double
huge
shame.
theme in Seminar
Yeah.
17? Yeah.
In
Well,
fact, I was going to
anyways,
ask, have you all reached the end of 17?
we have not. We
Because
have not.
the theme is it ends on the topic of shame
Yes.
and that no one has
Yes.
ever actually died from it.
I know. I love that phrase. There are some really great nuggets in there, and um there's the whole comparison between Immanuel Kant and Blaise Pascal to a figure who was named Vatel. It's like this French
Who's
cook.
Vatel?
He was a French, he's a character, he's a cook for the aristocracy. And he committed suicide because he was ashamed of his master undergoing humiliation. And
Oh,
Lacan says that Kant and Pascal were attempting to preserve the same intensity of honor which modernity had eradicated. This is the idea of both of them as philosophers who are ultimately perverts because they're
Very
wanting
interesting.
to sustain the big other. And so Lacan has this phrase in Seminar 17 about like they are, you can understand them like that. Like they're making a sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice for your individuality and kind of also this idea that they have a veiled religion, that they're like a secular religion. Anyways,
Yeah.
welcome, friends and comrades. Daniel Todd. I'm host of Emancipation's podcast, but we're more than kind of a podcast. We do study collectives right now. We are in the throngs of Seminar 17, the other side of psychoanalysis. And we thought it would be wise, many thanks to the Big Sig, to Andrew Flores for recommending Samuel McCormick, who has emerged in recent times as an extraordinarily lucid expositor of Lacanian thought. His lectures on Lacan are very popular and very needed interventions that offer systematic analyses, almost line by line analyses of Lacan's seminars, of the Écrit. And so we all, I think, Sam, have really benefited from your work, evidenced by the fact you brought maybe 30 or 40 people with you this morning. Welcome to new friends. What we wanted to do, Sam, and Sam is a professor of communications in addition to being an expert on Lacan. So we don't know how you do all of that, Sam. Maybe you can tell us. But this morning we wanted to invite Sam to help us with the enigma of the math themes of the four discourses. You know, I think it's pretty fair to say that Lacan would give these math themes to his students, the majority of whom probably were themselves very, very befuddled by them. And I think that was part of the purpose, was to show the limits of formalization. So this idea of trying to master all of them may be an impossibility. But nonetheless, we attempt and we attempt and we try to get a clear sense of them. And so, Sam, if we could, we'd like to turn it over to you to sort of just say a few things about it as you wish, and then hopefully leave a good chunk of time for back and forth and for discussion.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Daniel, for that generous introduction and this wonderful invite. I'm so delighted to be here. But you know what? I mean, now that we got going, you all got me thinking about shame. And so I'm looking at the final chapter in Seminar 17. And I know you all haven't got there yet. I remember too, when I was recording the lecture series on Seminar 17, it was really weird. I was kind of traveling around at the time and just kind of like recording wherever I could. And when I got to the end on shame, I just I saw what Miller had done with it, and I was like, that ain't fucking right. There was something about what he was doing that was just off for me. And so I really tried to strong arm this final chapter. And so check it out. As Daniel said, I really like sitting down and reading Lacan and then talking with other people about it. I was on a call with somebody the other day, and they said, "Why are you doing all of this?" I get this oftentimes. People are like, "Why are you doing all this? Why don't you become an analyst? Why aren't you blah blah blah?" And I just like, I think it's fun. I think it's really fun. It's like a puzzle. It's like puzzling to get in here. And it's also, there's some kind of momentum too. And I'm kind of in between series. So as some of you know, I just recorded a lecture series on Seminar 20. And the most fun, by the way, of doing these, I mean, y'all see like the recordings and stuff like that, but we do live get-togethers every other week. And a lot of people on this call are also involved in those live get-togethers. And I learned so much just hanging out with clinicians, scholars, students, independent learners. The trainees bring all kinds of wild shit to the conversation. So it was kind of a bummer recording this final lecture on shame on 17 because I didn't have the benefit of talking with the group and hearing what they thought about this stuff. I think that's important to note here. Like, lectures on Lacan is this and it's that, but it's fundamentally a community effort. And Daniel, I'm sure you kind of know this as well in your own work here, that it's you all that make this kind of thing so special and so unique. You know what I mean? Like Daniel and I, and maybe oh, I see Holly too. There's some professors on this call. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, we need a group to do this kind of stuff. And so having you all here is really special. And I don't know what to do with shame. I hope you'll check out that final lecture in 17 and see what you think. But I can tell you this, if you've got Seminar 17 in front of you, page 184 of the English, 213 in the French, has a very cool diagram. And yours looks, I'm sure, just like mine. It's this. Do you see this one? Do you notice how it looks quite different from the standard way that the discourse of the university is written? Or of any of the discourses. Really, you don't even need to know what variables are in the corners. Just notice how this thing is written. Do you see how you've got the vectors all lined up? There are 5 vectors. The most important thing about Lacan's theory of discourse is that there is no bottom vector. Daniel is precisely right in describing this as a matheme. Discourse for Lacan is the first matheme because it's an algorithmic structure that marks a certain impasse. That's the only thing that Lacan's formulas are up to. So you hear people talk about matheme this and matheme that. People talk about the matheme of fantasy. That is not a matheme. A matheme for Lacan has to be a formula that reveals an open space, an impasse, a hole in a formula that can't be plugged with a variable. And objet A from the start has been the primary variable that Lacan has used to mark gaps. You've often probably heard me describe it as the minimum irreducible distance between any two entities that allows them to remain distinct. That's what objet A always has marked. And it continues up to this point. And by this point, I just mean where I am in reading Lacan. So this winter, I'm going to teach a series on television. Some of you are going to be there. I hope all you all can be there. It's totally open. Come on in. And Lacan is still hot on this topic, that where two or more have gathered, you always have at least a third. The third is the minimum irreducible distance between any two entities that allows them to remain distinct. It's an opening. That's why also, for instance, when you think about the so-called Lacanian subject, this S with a slash through it, we often talk about this as though this is a split subject, two aspects of the subject. You could call it like an unconscious, enunciating subject. You could call it next to a conscious, grammatical subject. But remember, for Lacan, where two or more have gathered, there is always a third. The bar itself is a third element. It's the element that prevents the two from collapsing in on each other. And what Lacan has done with discourse in the late 1960s is he's found another formula, another way of marking some sort of a gap. It's really the primary focus of his entire thought, is showing how two never add up to one. And that's a really important element here. The fantasy, the fundamental fantasy, is that 1 + 1 = 1. That where two have gathered and love defines them, they become one. This oneness made of two is called the sexual rapport. That's why we hear all that talk about the sexual rapport doesn't exist and all this kind of shit. There is no such thing as a sexual. All he's saying there is when you squish two bodies together, they don't become one. Your partner doesn't complete you, nor do you complete them. We each remain divided subjects, which is why the basic Lacanian theory of love is giving what you don't have. Lack. You share lack with another. So I think it's important just to start zoomed way out and just let some of these Lacanian elements constellate and see how some of these things hang together. Objet A, love, discourse, truth, and the real are at stake here as well. I think that in my reading of Lacan, discourse is the fundamental breakthrough in his thought. I think it's the most interesting, unique thing that he came up with. And I can tell you, he agrees. Lacan thinks that Freud discovered analytic experience. Fair enough to say, right? The reason why Lacan says this in the mid to late 1960s is because he wants to say, and I, Jacques Lacan, have discovered analytic discourse. Freud invents analytic experience. Lacan invents analytic discourse. That's his wager. He thinks it's like his great contribution to psychoanalysis. He discovers analytic discourse. And out of the analytic discourse, he's able to spin three more, plus one, the capitalist discourse. So this seminar that you're studying, seminar 17, the other side of psychoanalysis, you'll notice it doesn't say much about the analytic discourse. It's fundamentally about the master's discourse. And the reason why is because the master's discourse is the inverse of the analytic discourse. And we'll see that. I'll draw some of these up for you. But basically, if you take the master's discourse and you turn it upside down, you get the analytic discourse. I'll draw it real quick just to get us off to a start and to show you why I called your attention to that diagram at the end of this momentous seminar that you're reading. So this is the master's discourse. You've seen it before, maybe not drawn in this way. This is how Lacan ultimately draws discourse. Notice again, there is no line between the two bottom elements. When you turn this thing upside down, if you can imagine it turned upside down, what you'll see is now in the position of the agent, you have objet A, there's your addressee all of a sudden, there's the analysand, here's the symptom, here's truth. We'll go through all this. But the reason why it's called, as you may already know, the other side of psychoanalysis is that the master's discourse is simply the analytic discourse upside down. And remember, in French, it's not other side, it's the inverse. It's the upside downing of analysis. So this discourse of the master is where Lacan begins. It's where he discovers his basic structure of discourse. But before that, if you recall, in seminars 16, really from the early 60s forward, Lacan has this theory of the signifier, where he says the signifier is what represents the subject to another signifier. He says this is the definition of the signifier. There is no other. And he says it throughout the 1960s. Well, the way that he's drawing that in his mind, whether he says it or not, is just like this. It's the master's discourse without the A. So Lacan's theory of the signifier is that the signifier, S1, is what represents the subject to another signifier. This is the basic, prototype for discourse. And then at the start of seminar 17, he's like, well, I don't want to leave my little a out. I have to have my little a. That's my baby. I don't want to leave the baby out. And he's like, well, why don't we just put it down there? He literally is just kind of like, how about just for funsies, we put it down here to round it out. That's how he arrives at the master's discourse. But it all starts with his definition of the signifier. That's, again, why I see discourse as a real breakthrough for Lacan. It's his first great turn out of signification. He never leaves language behind, but he's now working with something beyond the signifier as such. What he is now working towards is what he's going to call social linkage. Every discourse for Lacan, first and foremost, formulates an impasse. We're going to talk about that for sure. But every discourse for Lacan establishes, maintains, and allows for changed social relations. I hesitate to use the word relations because in Lacanian conversations, people lose their fucking minds when you say the word relation. So we can call them what Lacan does, which is just social linkages. And that's something I think you want to have in mind here. For Lacan, discourse is like a discourse formation, if you like your Foucault. It's a way that subjects are brought together, stitched together, kept apart even. But it's a way that you establish connections and disconnects between subjects. Everybody who's talking, myself included, is in a discourse. Lacan thinks you can't speak unless you're in a discourse, which is why the speech of the mystic is so profound to him, because it requires a new type of discourse, a discourse of the real, a discourse that he could only describe in the early 1970s as feminine. But I didn't come here to talk to you about that. What's great about Lacanian theories of discourse is that first and foremost, this is where you get Lacan's social theory. His social theory pops in his theory of discourse. This is also where you see his primary flirtation with Marx, which I think for you all is probably where your hearts and your heads are at. So I'll be eager to learn from you in our discussion today about that. He's definitely, as Daniel pointed out earlier, wrestling with what's happening in late 60s French culture. And he's really struggling hard to keep himself on the side of students, which is why you see the analytic discourse so well united with the hysteric. And dividing that union, that seamy union between the analyst and the student protester qua hysteric, from all the other professors, hence the university discourse, and the work that they do at the behest of power, hence the master discourse, which I take to be a very clear illustration of the basic, I mean, even orthodox Marxist line that the ruling ideas of any given era are always the ideas of that era's ruling class. That's why in the position of truth in the university discourse, you see the signifier of the master. Myself as a employee of the state of California, I am doing the work of the master. And all the more so when my university, San Francisco State University, reminds me that it's dedicated to social justice. This is one of the truths that Lacan reveals about radical social protest. And my man Kenneth Burke has a good read on this, also a great reader of Marx, second only to his readership of Freud. Begin by rejecting all authority, and you will end by accepting any. Some things that come up in discourse that you may have heard in Lacan's thought. Truth can be figured out through discourse. Semblance, agency, speech, otherness. His theory of production, if you want to call it production, is also on display here. Enjoyment, particularly surplus enjoyment. Surplus enjoyment starts to pop in Seminar 16, but it's not until 17 that Lacan really starts to think through this idea of the production of an object or commodity for the surplus enjoyment of a subject. And that's really what you get from the master's discourse. An S1 addressing an S2 and compelling it to produce a little objet A. Now, as you know, if you've seen my series on Seminar 16, surplus enjoyment is better defined with a little I next to that little a, making it a specular image of sorts. But whatever. Impotence and castration are also very much on display in Lacan's theory of discourse. So also is his theory of impossibility, and by extension, the real. So I push all of these out, not because I expect everybody to write all that shit down and all that. I'm pushing out all of these terms to let you know that when you really think hard and drill down on Lacan's theory of discourse, you gain access to all of these other concepts in their clinical and theoretical implications. You can figure out damn near 85% of Lacanian theory and technique just by understanding discourse. Its structure, its variables, its four basic types, its critical capitalist twist, and the relations between these discourses. So first and foremost, I want you to know that the stakes are pretty high here. I don't know how much of this you want, how far into this you want me to start. Do you want me to just jump to the discourses? Would it be useful to talk a little bit about like the general structure of discourse before we do that? Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
that would be great. I mean, to answer your question, we are under halfway through, Sam. So, I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
I think for a lot of us, this is a second read. I
Great.
would say probably Seminar 17 is like the top three most read seminars of
Mm-hmm.
Lacan,
Mm-hmm.
especially for folks in like sociology, history, humanities, or comp lit, next to the ethics, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And even a lot of commentators have shown that this social turn or concern about politics and so on it's a natural bridge. It's exactly what he was doing in the ethics seminar. So if you want to say more about like the general points about discourse before you actually get into how the four function for Lacan, that'd be very welcome.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, so now I guess you probably do want to write this stuff down. 5 points. There are 5 basic points to understanding Lacan's theory of discourse, at least as I see it. I mean, maybe you can reduce them to 3 or 4, but I think 5 is like the minimum stops. Think of these as like the piss breaks you have to take on that road trip to Nevada. You got to stop at least 5 times. And if you have a very old bladder like mine, and you're still unwilling to use the slop jar that you keep underneath your front seat, you may have to stop even more times than that. My grandparents had matching Cadillacs, and I could always tell the difference between them, not just because they had their names engraved on the dash of each, but because my grandfather always kept a half-full jar of piss underneath his driver's seat, and because my grandmother kept a pistol shoved between it was one of my jobs as a kid. I'd go out to her place and she'd be like, "Okay, you need to go out. I need you to go fire all the firearms, make sure everything's working, clean, and then reload." And they had guns stashed all over their house, so I'd have to go and like but every flower pot that looked like it had flowers in it, the flowers were fake, and there was a revolver and then I'd have to go get those. It was like an Easter egg hunt. Yeah. Poor neighbors listening to me out there firing off like 37. All right. There's one formula for discourse. There's one structure. It's got a twist. The capitalist discourse is a twist to that structure, but we'll talk about the structure. One formula that makes it a matheme, as Daniel rightly said. In each discourse, you have 4 variables. And you know these variables. There is, however, one exception. That's our second point. One formula, 4 variables. And once you understand each of these points, you got it. These variables exist in a fixed sequence. They rotate in a certain way. S1 always follows /S. You see, there's a sequence, and that's the crucial part that forces Lacan to lock down 4 classic discourses. If you want to break that chain, and I think Bruce does this at the end of the Lacanian subject, where he goes through and talks through like all the different 24 or 28 permutations that you can get with these variables, you have to break the sequential ordering of the variables. Lacan doesn't allow it for whatever reason. I think he likes the kind of like the anal containment of just 4. It was troubling for him when he actually had to poop out a 5th in the capitalist discourse. He couldn't quite bring himself to do it. You see, he likes 4s. Which brings us to our 4th. There are 4 basic discourses as a result of this sequence, plus 1, which is the capitalist discourse. And these 4 discourses, master, university, hysteric, and analyst, have 4 interdiscursive relations. So notice how that works. You've got 4 basic variables, S1, S2, little a, and /S, that plug into 4 basic discourses, master, university, hysteric, and analyst. And then these 4 discourses allow for 4 basic interdiscursive relations. Now notice this. This is how Lacan thinks. From variable to formula to interformula. Let me be clear, though. This is not a universe of discourse. Things don't always hang together for Lacan. He sees formulations of this sort as ways of marking outer limits, really inner limits that are outer extimate limits of formulations themselves. He thinks radical social theory is like radical psychoanalytic thought. It always works at finding gaps in itself and then dancing around them. So it looks pretty nice, 4 to 4 to 4, as you zoom out from these variables. But for Lacan, remember, this symmetrical formulation of discourse by fours is there primarily for him to arrive at an impossibility, a point that can't be formulated, like a black hole that you can only study by way of atmospheric turbulence around it. You know where a black hole is because of the weird shit that happens around it with other cosmic phenomenon, right? You can't look at a black hole, it swallows light, there's nothing to see there. There's not even nothing to see there. All right, I don't want to get too weird. It's too early for that. Even for you on the East Coast, some of you actually some of y'all, it's evening time. Y'all be having drinks right now. I also don't want to run you ragged. That's another thing. And I'm sorry about that because sometimes I do like to run myself ragged. So I want to try and be as crisp as possible with this. Let's take it one step at a time and then we can talk more. First and foremost, the formula. That's what I told you was first. There's a formula, a structure that is the basis for discourse. It's mathematical. It has the 4 spots. You see a version of it on page 184, I think it was, that I showed you at the start of this from the final pages of 17. And it marks a certain impasse, marked by the absence of a line or a vector at the bottom of discourse. This part is the key part. And weirdly enough, it's the part that everybody ignores. Everybody likes to focus on the 4 variables and how they circulate and then debate them and get them all wrong. For Lacan, what is at stake in all 4 variables and all 4 discourses is the impasse that they allow to be formulated. Only thing that matters to him is the 5th variable, the one that nobody ever talks about, written in the seminar you're reading as a delta of impotence. So you've seen it before. Let me just draw it again so that you have it in front of you. All right, you all see this blackboard in front of you? Thank you. So the structure that I'm talking about here, that is the first and foremost thing to understand, is you've got an agent addressing an other, and there's a result, a product. Something is produced by that interaction, by that arrow of adversivity. And this product is invariably an object of surplus enjoyment for the agent who spoke. There is, however, another factor to consider, which is the truth that conditioned this subject's ability to speak in the first place. And then by the early 1970s, Lacan adds another arrow. And you can see this in that diagram in your seminar on page 184 that I had totally forgotten until Daniel got me thinking about shame. This is the basic structure of Lacanian discourse. An agent addressing an other, a product, something resulting from that address that's typically figured as an object of consumption for the agent. Really, this is a simple consumer relation. Here's you down at Old Slavey looking for a new t-shirt. Here is the worker in Bangladesh whose little nimble childlike fingers produced those stitches that you so well like because they last forever. Here's that t-shirt that you get for $6.99 as a result. So you can see how well this lends itself to the master discourse, for sure. It gets more complicated when you get into the other discourses. Throughout it all, though, there is some truth that is divided and cannot be seen from the product. There's a truth that structures your ability, late modern subject, to go to Old Slavey in search of t-shirts. And that truth is typically divided from the thing that you consume. It conditions your subjectivity, but remains inaccessible from the position here of the commodity. For Lacan, if we're looking at the master's discourse, this truth is that of barred subjectivity. What the master can't handle is the truth, which is that they're castrated like the rest. That's one way to figure this. But anyway, I just want to do the formula first. This is the basic formula for discourse in Lacan's world. The right side is something he's also going to start calling the pole of jouissance. This entire side is going to have to do with jouissance for him. At this point, though, all he's saying is that whatever is produced from this address or this communicative interaction, whatever is produced is going to be a surplus of some kind to be enjoyed, but strictly at a very specific level of enjoyment, which is 100% desirous. In fact, he doesn't even need to use the word enjoyment here. What he's really talking about is how desire operates. This product is one for the surplus enjoyment of the agent. And that surplus, if you think through the Proto-Indo-European root of surplus, it's from pele, meaning to fill. This is that little thing that somehow fills you in, but only for a moment. It's that snack that you had when you were hungry. It sated you for one moment, but now you're hungry again. That's surplus enjoyment for Lacan. It is not a lasting, real enjoyment. It's really more like the fleeting satisfaction of a desire. That's where he starts with all this. This is the formula. I also, however, want to call your attention to the part that is the most fundamental here. Increasingly, as Lacan gets going, this space between truth and product, cause and effect, without a vector, is for him the great centerpiece of discourse. And by the end of seminar 19B, or worse, this is going to become an impossibility. Impotence raised to the level of an impossibility. And where you have impossibility, you have the real. Like I said, once you push down on discourse, all the key concepts start popping up. You can now understand, and Lacan finally understands in the early 1970s, the relationship between truth and the real. It is perfectly captured here. This is also why in my lecture series on Seminar 17, if I'm not mistaken, the main image is one where I've circled these two elements, because everything turns conceptually and clinically on understanding this relationship. Clinically speaking, not all y'all are psychoanalysts, but in lectures on Lacan, we get a lot of psychoanalysts coming through. In dealing with a neurotic subject, a neurotic analysand, your job as an analyst is not to hold a place for their desire. That's fucking ridiculous. That's part of what you're supposed to do, but that's hardly it. Your job is to hold a place for the real. That little a that is the semblance of agency we see in the analytic discourse is not object little a. That's a figure of abjection. The great analyst is the one who cannot play object, but abject. Trash, refuse, garbage. A remainder that just won't go away, like a piece of dog shit stuck between the tread of your boots. That's the great analyst. They're excellent at playing dumb, deaf, and oftentimes dead, because they're excellent at holding a place for the real. And that's what this place is. This is the place of the real. And everything that happens in analytic experience, when it happens well, is what Lacan calls the wail of an appeal to the real. True symptoms always put us right on the verge of the real. So this is the basic formula, and I wanted to just spin it out for a minute so you could see how far you can go with it. You don't need all this extra stuff, though. You can just have the basic formula for Lacan's theory of discourse, and you're good to go. There. I told you there are 4 variables. I think it's probably worth just looking at them. And I know that for some of you, this is going to be old news, but for a lot of you, myself included, I always learn something new when I rock through this stuff. These are 4 variables that you plug into the 4 basic positions in a discourse: agent, other, product, and truth. So the formula you just wrote, have that in front of you, because then you're going to take these 4 variables and you can plug them into any of those 4 corners. Wherever these variables go, they retain a certain meaning, a certain sense, an aura, if you read Benjamin. S1 is what we often refer to as the master signifier. Which is fine. That's a fine way to talk about it. More precisely, though, focus on the number 1 here. Wherever S1 shows up, you will see something of the one, as Lacan puts it. This is what matters most, I think, in Lacan's theory of discourse in its fullest development, but also readily apparent at the start of his theory of discourse also. S1 doesn't just demonstrate mastery where it shows up. It shows a relationship to oneness. That's why there's a 1 in there. It's an S1. And everything turns on understanding Lacan's understanding of 1. And for him, it's really simple. That shit doesn't exist. Oneness for him is a fabrication. It's an illusion. That's why you've heard me say since my series on Seminar 14 forward that the fundamental fantasy is a belief that oneness can be rendered. For the neurotic, I don't care what their so-called fundamental fantasy is, it always turns on a relationship to the one. And all 4 of Lacan's classic discourses turn on a relationship to oneness. So here it is. Master signifier is the signifier or the element of the discourse that typically provides an illusion of oneness, of coherence, of singularity, of autonomy, of fusion. S2, wherever it goes, is going to give you a sense of knowledge. Wherever S2 shows up in one of Lacan's discourses, it will have an aura of knowledge. It will have something to do with knowledge. Even when in the hysterics discourse, the S2 shows up as ignorance. Don't forget, for Lacan, ignorance is the most elaborate form of knowledge that we know. I mean, I wish he read more in classic Marxist thought. I mean, I would love it if Lacan had actually taken ideology seriously. I don't think he ever did. I think he basically, speaking of Seminar 7 on ethics, I think he took ideology as, isn't art stupid, and then moved on. Wilfred, what's going on out there? Oh, hold on, your mic is turned off, Wilfred.
I have a patient who might be a problem for that because uh, we can talk now after more than 2, 3 years about eating, but about anything else, he says, I do not know.
Ah, yeah. I think for Lacan, ignorance is a pretty elaborate concept. And it separates basically, though, that down to two boxes. For Lacan, most I don't know your patient, Wilfred, but if they have the clinical structure of neurosis,
Oh,
Lacan would
it's
say,
psychotic. He is psychotic.
oh, okay, that's something different then. Um, okay, let's hold off on that for 1 second. The type of I don't know that the psychotic might bring to a session is a pretty profound one. It reminds me of a guy I work with. Some of you know, Henrik in London. He works with autistic children primarily and adolescents. And one of the things he says and often reminds us is that when you talk about the Lacanian subject and the Lacanian clinic, remember that treating neurotics is very different from treating psychotics. He says, for the neurotic, you often need to take their world apart. But for the psychotic, you need to help them build a world.
Yes.
Because relative to their world, they, as Wilfred so well put it, don't know. They don't know. And the dilemma of the neurotic is that they think they do know. So Lacan has this excellent riff in the early 1970s on knowledge. And he says that most knowledge evinces a passion for ignorance. We want to have knowledge. We want to grasp knowledge. We want to know stuff in order to better sustain this passion for ignorance that we have. You see, when he says knowledge in this sense, he means that you want to have a closed epistemic order where you know everything. It's like your kitchen cabinet, where you know where the plates go, and you know where the cups go, and you know where the spoons go. That for him is a very dead understanding of knowledge. It's a closed epistemic system. Lacan's epistemic systems are always epistemic systems that are leaky, that have an opening. This is the kitchen cabinet that actually has a hole drilled in the back of it, and you can allowing you to reach into your neighbor's kitchen cabinet and pull shit out. This is a cabinet that would have a cracked glass and a handle that doesn't allow the door to be open. But for most neurotics, the fantasy is that you could have knowledge about oneself, about one's partner, about one's disorder, and then grasp it, hold it, put it in your pocket, and go home. For him, that evinces a passion for ignorance. Because what you want to know more than anything is that you don't have to deal with the fact that your knowledge is limited. For him, though, I think that there's another form of ignorance, and it's that of the psychoanalyst, what he calls dacta ignorantia, from the Latin word that was coming up in the 15th century, I believe, with Nicholas de Causa. You can look it up, it's something separate, and it was learned ignorance. And you've heard it before, it's not that fancy. It's simply learning that you have a lot more to learn. Like, for instance, look behind Daniel right now. All those books, and I guarantee Daniel doesn't rest on his laurels. He's studied those books, but I guarantee he's thinking right now about the books on his desk that he's still reading. Notice that difference there. You see, right? That's the difference. The neurotic wants to have all the books on the shelf and to say, I've read them all and I'm done. I've got it all down. I've got it all figured out. But what Lacan is after is a learned ignorance, where the more you read and the more you learn, the more you realize you've got so much still to figure out. That humbled position is a position that I've only ever seen in the most well-read people I know. The reason why they're extremely well-read is that they always find themselves at the end of the book wondering what happens next. And they're on to the next book.
Mm.
As a result, they cultivate a relation to ignorance. They've learned a lot, but they also recognize that there's a limit to their current understanding. And beyond that limit, who knows? Notice that difference, though. The neurotic has a passion for ignorance that's premised on a fantasy of containment. I have it all. My kitchen cabinet is secure. But a great scholar, a great learner, is one who always can say, I don't know, who lives daily in a state of ignorance, but it is a learned ignorance, a cultivated ignorance. This is what the analyst is able to embody. The analyst embodies ignorance. So, Wilfred, you may have known on day one that this patient was psychotic. You may have gotten the inkling then. I would bet, though, that you did not on day one formulate that diagnosis. I bet you waited and listened for more until all the evidence was there and you played dumb until you finally got the diagnosis in place. That type of playing dumb, where you wait and wait and wait, is crucial. Some of the great analysts that I like to hang out with will say things like, I wait until my neurotic patients are just on the verge of understanding their truth, of understanding their symptoms, just when they're right on top of it. And I said, what do you do then? Then they say, I just give them a little push. I just give them a little nudge, just a little nudge, but they've got to be, the analysand has to be right on top of their symptom, right on top of the insight, dancing around it, stumbling over it before the analysts that I trust would give them a little push. Up to that point, the analyst is just playing dumb. Analysand wants to tell you a joke, even if you've heard it 1,000 times. Don't laugh. Wilfred, thanks for jumping in there on knowledge. Because when the psychotic says, I don't know, it means something different from when the neurotic finally admits it.
I see. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Very, very good stuff. I look forward to talking more with you about that. Slowly but surely, we're getting there, y'all. Little a typically means object cause. I say object cause because it can signal the object of your desire, but also the lack that conditions it. You probably already know all this.
Mm-hmm.
And I would typically say it's of desire, but not always. It can be of desire, but in the analytic discourse, it has also become an object of repulsion. Notice that difference. If little a is the cause of desire, in the analytic discourse, it's the cause of its opposite, not desire, but repulsion. That's why Lacan makes so many jokes about the wastebasket, about trash cans. He's constantly talking about trash cans because he thinks that's the only fit place for an analyst. At the end of an analysis, the analyst is a piece of shit, as Lacan calls it in his report on Seminar 19 or worse. The analyst is a piece of crap, he says, with which the analysand does their work. And the basic resistance in analytic treatment is that of the analyst. The basic resistance of psychoanalysis is the analyst's refusal to become that piece of crap. That is the barrier to psychoanalysis. All these analysts with all their degrees and all their fancy readings of Lacan and all their knowledge, they refuse to let that go. And that is the resistance to be overcome in analysis, according to Lacan. It's never been that of the analysand. The primary resistance in analytic treatment is that of the analyst. And it is a resistance to abjection. It's a resistance to becoming the piece of trash. And you know why I'm saying this? Because analyses have become endless. analyses have become interminable. Remember, even Freud was hot on the idea of an interminable analysis. People think their analyses need to go on for years. The great lesson for Lacan is how to end an analysis. Analyses should come to an end. And at that end, the analyst is fired, thrown away, garbage, refuse, a stone, even Lacan calls the analyst in Seminar 17. A stone, one that could be thrown like a piece of coal or trash. Ellie, how you doing?
I'm good, Sam. How are you?
Better now that you're in the mix.
Aw, you're too kind.
Yep, I know.
So why do you think that is, that the analyst has that resistance? Is it because they are coming at it from a position of like desire to help? Like I know, at least in the field of psychology, that that's something that's often talked about, is this like desire to help others. And so it seems like it's almost going against the nature or desire of like what we're there for, to become this piece of shit or piece of trash.
Yeah, it could be. It could be something around the desire to help, a kind of like a fraught caritas ideology. Yeah, I mean that could totally be it. Um, I think it comes down to knowledge primarily. I think part of the dilemma is that you work so hard through all of your degrees in psychology, and then you get your master's, and then you get your PhD maybe, and then I don't know, man. I sit on a lot, way too many clinical psychology dissertation committees these days, and it's super fun. It's interesting to see what these people are up to, but damn if they're not excited about the knowledge that they've got. They get so excited to become what Lacan calls the subject supposed to know. And you'll note, like in treating a neurotic, the neurotic shows up and tells the analyst more or less, fix me. Things aren't going great in my relationship, fix me. You're the doctor, you've got all the diplomas. Is it true that I suffer from anxiety? Is it true? And they want you to solve that for them. So the analyst shows up, as Ellie puts it, with a desire to cure. And guess what? The analysand shows up and says, that's what I'm here for. And may even say as much, I'm paying you for this. And you're going to sit there and play dumb? Tell me what's wrong with me. Fix me, fix me, fix me. I think when you get those two together, it creates problems. But first and foremost, I think
And an analyst, like a neurotic and an analyst with the desire to cure.
Yeah, that's one way to read it, Ellie, I would say. But I would say once you peel those two apart and look beneath them, I think what you see is a perverse relation to knowledge. The analyst is a fetishist of knowledge. That's how that entire tradition has gotten away with, why they've been so willing to suffer the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders since World War II. Like, how could you suffer a volume of that sort? Whether you're a psychoanalyst or not, you're aware of the DSM. Why would you suffer through this dictionary of what we now call characterological abnormalities? Because it's all about knowledge. I think fundamentally that the psychoanalyst has a hard time letting go of all the stuff they've learned about Lacan. Think about it. If you're an analyst, if you're a therapist, Ellie, I know you work in the trade, but I also know that you're smart enough to find your way into all these other resources. But people get so hooked on Lacan, and then they show up and basically want to play doctor. And I put it like that very precisely to capture Ellie's point, but to also emphasize the sexuation that's happening here as well. Let's play doctor. And that's all the analyst is ever doing, playing doctor. That is a role, a bit part in the theatrics of psychoanalysis that has to be abandoned, according to Lacan. The subject supposed to know is fundamentally, at the end of analysis, the abject supposed to go. And one place more than any other, the fucking trash. But that trajectory from the analyst on high with all their Lacan books and all their diplomas hanging on the wall Notice that's the first object of transference, right? The analysand shows up and says, fix me, you're the doctor. And the job of the analyst from day one is to distance themselves, to begin the slow fall from that throne-like position, from authority on high to piece of trash in the bottom of the basket. That is a long and difficult fall for the analyst to take. Think about it. You have $400,000 in student loan debt that you're trying to pay off. See, some of you are smiling because you fucking know this. What did you pay for? You paid to become a piece of trash? No. You paid for status. You paid for linguistic and cultural capital, as Bourdieu would put it. And eventually, hopefully, some economic capital would flow in as well. But a lot of these folks just enjoy telling others that they're psychoanalysts. Notice all of this really basic bullshit trappings of late modern social life. The analyst is just one more of these folks. And I think that's a dilemma, Ellie. And all of this is occurring behind their so-called desire to care, desire to cure, desire to help.
It's a
You know
narcissistic
what I mean? Like,
desire at the end of the day, it sounds like and we've talked about this before, I think, this desire to fix because then it shows your own ability to make one out of this shattered person.
that's it. Yeah. Yep. Let me stitch you together. I'll stitch you so well that, like that shirt you bought at Old Navy, I mean Old Slavey, you won't even be able to see the stitches. That's how tightly they've been tucked. You see, I mean, and that's just ridiculous because at the end of analysis, you don't see a subject stitched together, at least in the case of a neurotic. Now, Wilfred's doing his job, and what you would see at the end of a psychotic treatment might be a subject who knows where they are in the world and feels stitched in or hemmed in, safely contained and held in their environment. But with the case of a neurotic, you want them to end like that slashed S that you see on your screen as a barred or split subject. Daniel, what's on your mind?
This idea of the trash, I mean, we had studied 16 from another to the other pretty closely, and obviously there's a lot of allusions made to even later in Lettre D and in Lacan's reflections on civilization and its discontents to the status even of the proletariat and to the shame of the working class. And so there's a lot of nodal points of trash. And I think that it's very interesting to pivot from the clinical to the social application of the motif of trash. And one of the things that's interesting apropos the master's discourse is that you could say perhaps that the efficacy of it and also what results in its collapse is the capacity of the slave to sustain, maybe you could say almost like a valorization of it. And one of the things about modernity is that the trash is we no longer know how to valorize it. And so therefore that then links us back to the shame. And so it would be interesting to see how, since we're talking about the original discourse and also the historical origin of the master's discourse, it's always something that interests me because one of the things that Andrew and I are very interested in is Jean-Claude Milner's incredible analysis of the discourses of Lacan and how they relate to a moment where Lacan was actually responding to the Stalinist theory of linguistics and the Stalinist theory of historicism and the Marxist theory of historicism by providing a kind of dialogue with Foucault as an alternative to the Marxist theory of history. And so one of the big questions, therefore, is, are these discourses, are their origins historically located, right? Like, is there a historical figure that births something like the master's discourse? And the answer, I think, Sam, and I wonder what you think, is that, like, ultimately there's not. There's rather kind of avatars of the discourses, like Socrates is an avatar of the hysterics discourse, but he's not the originator. There's no like originator of the discourses. They have they therefore have not an ahistorical valence, but they do need to be situated historically, and they can be, but that is not something Lacan does. That's kind of left to Lacanians to do. And so I was just curious what you think about this idea of a discourse which can handle the trash well, because that's Lacan's definition of civilization, right? Civilization emerges when shit is well managed.
There you go.
Right?
I love it.
Right? And that's why like
true.
every superior civilization, there's like an inverse relationship to their capacity to manage the shit. Right? And
That's great.
and then the question I think of Marxism is when the shit decides to become a hysteric, right?
Oh, interesting.
Right? Because I mean because what does Lacan call the proletariat of Marx's time? The hysterics discourse. But it was a successful hysterics discourse. And I don't think that Lacan has an optimism regarding the student 68 discourse as a new hysterics discourse that will actually be successful.
That's great. Yeah.
Anyways, those are just some general thoughts. Yeah.
In fact, I mean, I think the student protest of 68, it doesn't point him to the hysterics discourse. It helps him define the university discourse, which has everything to do with power. The university is just the mouthpiece for power. And that's the basic Marxist triangle is between philosophers, power, and the people. And basically what happens is the university discourse becomes the philosopher co-opted inadvertently. They don't even know what they're doing, co-opted to be the mouthpiece for power, divided against the people. And a great, instead, like organic approach to intellectualism, which I think Guattari kind of fancied himself in this camp as well, would be one that would, which is why he moves his family into a fucking insane asylum, is look at me, I'm united with my analysans. We all live in the insane asylum and my daughter hates me. So like this idea that the philosopher would instead unite with the people, like the analyst uniting with their analysand, would somehow create some better way of taking on power. But I think it's just a way of negotiating that Marxist triangle of P's.
And that's why Lacan has so many students in 16 and 17 that are Freudian Marxists. And notice that he never uses the name Wilhelm Reich, but Wilhelm Reich as the doctor of love, who really would say the task of the psychoanalyst is to fuse with the workers, right? And to bring, that's why he drove his bus around Germany and like literally gave free psychoanalytic clinics.
Yeah.
And
we still do that in San Francisco. It's called the Clinic Without Walls.
You do?
Yeah, my man Thomas Marchevsky runs it. It's totally lit. Yeah, he shows up like somebody gets shot on the corner, and they all jump in the bus and they drive the van down to the corner.
So what would Lacan say about that, Sam? That would be a question I would have for you.
Yeah, for sure. Let's just start at the beginning with the historicization of the discourses. It's something that, I mean, you bring this up, Daniel, it's a really crucial point. Lacan is going to say that the first discourse, historically speaking, in a kind of like naive chronological sense, there's going to say, and he always quotes someone else, who'd be like, Dr. Lacan, isn't the master's discourse the first discourse? Right? Because there were masters before the emergence of the modern research university. The first philosopher to be a professor was Immanuel Kant. So think about this. Prior to that, there was no university discourse. Historically speaking, prior to the birth of the modern research institution, crystallized in the figure of Immanuel Kant, which was the first philosopher turned professor in a modern environment. You had philosophers out there in the world. Were they doing the university discourse? I think you could probably argue that. I mean, Plato had his own academy. Yeah. But Lacan doesn't want to traffic in any of these intellectual or cultural histories. He doesn't buy any of that shit. What matters for him is the analytic discourse. Remember what I said. So Freud discovers analytic experience. He discovers the clinic. He invents the clinic. Lacan thinks that his great contribution to this tradition is that he discovers the discourse, the speaking that occurs in that clinic, and he figures out how to formulate it. That's what we're working on here today, is formulating that discourse. And Lacan thinks this is his great angle. And all the other discourses are simply formulas that spin out from the basic formulation of the analytic discourse. So what he would say is, technically speaking, the master's discourse comes after the analytic discourse. Because it is by taking the analytic discourse and giving it a quarter turn, or I'd say a half turn to invert, that you would get the master's. Take the analytic discourse and give it a quarter turn. He's all about taking the analytic discourse and then rejiggering it to create the others. Notice, for Lacan, it has nothing to do with history and everything to do with mathematics. He is operating at the level of a formulation. It's simply a formula. That's how he sees this. And he's going to say, okay, so if you want to come along and ask, where's the great university discourse? Who's the paragon of the university discourse? He's going to say, like, that's fine. I mean, you can ask that question. But for him, he's going to say, no, man, the university discourse is what happens when the analyst fails. When the analyst fails to maintain their trajectory toward trash and remains the subject supposed to know, this is where the analytic discourse slips a quarter turn clockwise, and it becomes the university discourse. And if you follow lectures on Lacan, you know how I put this. This is the analyst playing professor. Nothing is worse for treating neurotics than an analyst trying to play professor. Notice, they're no longer playing dumb. Now they're playing smart. They're pretending to know what the fuck is going on. And that's a terrible place for an analysis with a neurotic to be, I believe, reading Lacan. But here, notice, the university discourse is not localized in any sort of like historical moment. I would say it's with Kant. I think it's, you heard me just say it. But Lacan's like, I don't even care about that question. Lacan is training analysts. And he thinks that the basic function of the university discourse, in addition to like making fun of his late 60s professors, is to be able to show how analysis goes bad. Analysis goes bad when the analyst starts to play professor. Why? Because when the analyst plays professor, the analysand is tempted to become a student. And students don't know a damn thing. So that is a dilemma for Lacan. It looks like progress because the analytic discourse takes a quarter turn. We don't have the discourses in front of us. I love that we're like way ahead of where we're supposed to be in this conversation. But when the analytic discourse just take all the four positions and shift them clockwise, you get the university discourse. He sees that as a failure. And I think that's how he would do this. I think what he would say is, forget about the history. Let's talk about the formulas and what this serves as a guide rail, as a guardrail, as it were, for analytic trainees. Don't become the university, I think is what he would say again and again. Now we got some questions stacking up here. I like how this is unfolding. Andrew, what's going on?
Hey Sam, how you doing?
Outstanding.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of piggyback off of what Tut raised, because I think it's really important. There's always a sort of insistence to want to historicize these discourse or try to locate them, but I think Daniel made a good point in referencing a thinker that we're both influenced by. His name is Jean-Claude Milner, who was a French Maoist and kind of attended some of the seminars, but he wrote a book called The Clear Oeuvre, or In Search of Clarity, which is this one right here, published by Diaresis. I don't know if you'll see it. But he pretty much structures Lacan's thought in terms of classicisms and the trajectory of his thought. And I think it's important because he's relating these discourses to, as you said, mathematics, and it spawned off from science. It's psychoanalysis and Lacan's sort of relationship to science. And really what these discourses show are what for lack of a better term, we could call breaks or epistemological breaks, if you like your Althusser. But Milner says this, that there is a break with episteme and the modern world or modern science because of the rise of modern science and also capitalism and the absolutization of the market. Science is focused on precision, and with precision comes technology, and with comes technology becomes mathematics. And so Lacan is structuring discourse not on like symbolic iterations and networks of power like Foucault would, but still there's epistemological breaks that Foucault points out in his archaeology. Rather, it is in the way that science and its discourse shifts in its formulas that it has. And I think that's why he's so focused on thermodynamics and physics, because physics is focused not on language, but on pure writing, which is mathematics. And this is why he also wants to bring logic back to mathematics. And so really the master's discourse is not a historical juncture, but a sort of logical precedence that we have to presuppose for university, for hysterics, for the analyst. But we can only do so from the fact that we're talking about analysis as a discourse without speech. And we create these little map themes to say, this is where the master comes about. This is where the university happens. Not in a historical juncture, but in an epistemological break. And that would be because of the break from the ancient universe to the modern universe that is scientific and mathematical.
I like this turn toward math. And in fact, I'm reminded of one of my friends does improv, and he's always yes-anding me. I love it. We get so fucking absurd. We stretch out all kind of way because he yes-ands. He doesn't say yeah, but he says yes, and. It's always this additive logic. And were I to yes and this, Andrew, I would ask, what is mathematics most precise about? And I think the answer that appealed to Lacan the most was mathematics is most precise when it comes to impossibility.
Exactly.
When it comes to tracing outer limits of epistemic systems. And that may be the break that, I don't know this book by Milner, but I mean, it's a kind of a common thing in the history and philosophy of science, where you can track the shift in modern scientific, or in scientific thinking, let's not even call it modern, from the attempt to arrive at a universe, a full and coherent explanation for how everything hangs together, to the efforts like in chaos theory. I mean, that stuff gets started pretty early too. You could even see this in computer science and informatics, where they're studying noise. And I mean, that's really what Lacan's interested in thermodynamics. It's about entropy. But what you're looking at in these moments are points of friction, variables that don't allow themselves to be quite accounted for. And then the goal becomes to formulate as close as possible to the edge of that void. That is what Lacanian discourse is. It is a formulation that is structured around a void. The void is represented by that delta of impotence between truth and product. The entire discursive system for Lacan is structured around this void. And we just use the delta to mark it. But the entire discourse is there to show you where it's not. This for him is scientific work at its most precise way, because the formula is there ultimately to bring you to the edge of the void. And this delta of impotence turned impossibility is the edge of the void. Lacan talks about it as like the threshold of the real. It's difficult because, and Bruce fucks this up in the translation, he talks about it as like access to the real. But when Lacan really talks about that, it's really more like touchao. He talks about it as touching on the real or brushing up against the real. The formula is the way that we arrive at the doorstep or the threshold of the real, not the real itself. We arrive at its threshold. That for him, I think, is something that only mathematics can do. And I think you're right to link logic in here as well. Because for Lacan, I mean, just think about this. the Greek word logos, origin of the word logic, in antiquity, that meant discourse. He thinks that what he has found in a theory of discourse is the ultimate logic that for him gives a mathematical footing for psychoanalysis, and particularly as a technique, as a therapeutic technique. He's like, holy fuck, I now have formulas that I can use to train analysts. So all of the little symbols that we're looking at here, these are not letters. They're certainly not signifiers. These are variables. These are written symbols. So notice how Andrew also pushes on the matter of writing, of pure writing. This for Lacan is key. You can't do math without writing. And when you're writing mathematically, you are not using words. And all the letters and numbers that show up in your formula, they are not letters and they are not numbers anymore. S1 is not a letter and it's not a number. It is an algebraic symbol. It is a variable to be plugged into different equations. And the discourse of the master, for instance, is just an equation. This is Lacanian math, my friends. This is all it's ever been about. This that you're seeing on your screen right now, this is a mathematical formula. This is Lacanian math. And it's with the discovery of discourse and this structure that we're talking about today that Lacan finally gets it. You see, he's been talking about like these variables and these symbols. He's been using them. The graph of desire came pretty close, but it wasn't mathematical. That's why, for instance, in the subversion of the subject essay, he's fucking around and trying to arrive at imaginary numbers. Square root of -1, he's messing around, he's always messing with numbers. The dilemma here, basically, as I see it, if you want to be like an intellectual historian, is in the early 1940s, Lacan really is influenced by informatics, cybernetics, and early computer science. He's really thinking hard algorithmically, ones and zeros, baby. He loves this about the symbolic. His whole theory of the symbolic is premised on a digital calculus of ones and zeros. You see, 1 equals presence, 0 equals absence. And when you get those binaries popping, you suddenly have the symbolic. The entire symbolic is structured on a digital theory, digital in the sense of ones and zeros. That's where Lacan is with math in the 1940s and by extension in the 50s. For him, language is a digital system. It's not until the late 1960s that he breaks through into math. Now we get a full shift away from informatics, away from thermodynamics too, my friends, and into mathematics proper. And with it, Andrew was right, logic. This is why he's so hot on like symbolic logicians. This is why he keeps talking about Russell, for instance. Russell was like his little boyfriend for real. He just so wanted that action. Look at Russell. He can write the history of Western philosophy and still do complex, logical, analytical, mathematical theory. Wow. So Lacan takes a mathematical turn, and that's where you all are with Seminar 17. You are at this point where he realizes, holy shit, between 1 and 0 in any binary system is a third missing variable that describes the differential relation between those two binaries. And he realizes objet A just isn't enough to capture that anymore. Discourse is his next great breakthrough. It is fundamentally math. So I hate to say it, but like, look at you all. You never thought you'd want to do math in your life, and here you are on a Sunday. This is your day off work, laborers, and here you are wanting to do math.
Oh yeah, you should ask Ellie. Like I'm literally on my own trying to learn geometry and calculus.
That's a good way to do it. That's a good way. Calculus, that's fucked up, man. Whoever invented calculus, who was it? Leibniz?
Leibniz. It's the debacle, Leibniz or Newton.
I mean, this is proof that maybe the great intellectual sadist wasn't Kant or his inverse, Marquis de Sade. It was fucking Leibniz because he invented calculus. Noah, thanks for your patience. Who have you wrestled to the ground recently? What the hell's going on out there?
Oh, geez. Not a whole lot. We get about 9 hours of daylight, which completely like fucks up my entire everything. So a whole lot going on the Midwest. So so when you mentioned this, I just find it completely strange that an analyst would even find it appropriate to, quote unquote, like play smart and begin to talk to an analyst and in that sort of manner of like playing smart. Like I feel like that's just like the first cardinal rule of I mean, just from my understanding, don't know anything, is that like an analyst is supposed to make minimal punctuations in order to nudge the subject to a particular, or nudge the analyst and to a particular direction in order to allow them to wrestle with their own thing, antagonism or whatever. And so for an analyst to just completely, it seems like a complete sabotage of the whole process if they're going to play like the position of knowledge or the one who knows. Like I just don't, how common is that? Because that blows my mind. But then it and so it kind of like brings this thing to my attention of like the importance of being cognizant of one's utterance, like when it comes to being an analyst, and the way that you position your ear, for inquiry, and like and using the punctuation as a way to, to ask for more. This is kind of my question, I guess. Where does the understanding of transference become useful?
Great. I'm so glad that that's where you're putting this. Yes, because you ask, okay, so first of all, I want everyone to just hear this. As Noah was getting started, notice how he paused his own discourse to say, I don't know. Notice how Noah is performing the very answer to his own question. He is doing the work that a good analyst does by always inserting, I don't know. And isn't that the great answer? You show up on day one, session one, and you say, I'm sick, fix me. Aren't you the doctor? Aren't you supposed to know? Already the analyst can say something like, we just met. We just met. I mean, I don't need to talk to you for a minute. You just walked in my door and I'm supposed to be able to fix you. I'm an analyst, not a wizard. You see? But notice how Noah is very well performing this kind of learned ignorance. He says, I don't know, and then asks a super profound question that ends on the role of the transference in all of this. So as some of you probably already know, transference very simply is when the analysand shows up and projects some of their emotional affective life onto the analyst. And a good analyst is able to say, oh, now I see your relation to authority. Now I can get a sense of who I am for you. And as a result, can then maneuver from that position. But it's all about how the analysand positions in the transference the analyst. And more often than not, when the analysand shows up and says, I'm sick, fix me, help me enjoy my symptoms again, because they don't want to be fixed, right? They just want to learn to enjoy their symptoms once more. People come to analysis because their symptoms have stopped producing enjoyment. My love and I fight all the time and fuck so little that I've had to go to therapy. We've stopped having makeup sex, so now I'm in therapy. Help me get back to having this fraught relationship where all we do is fight and fuck. They don't want to be fixed, but they show up and play their part and express, as Ellie so well put, a desire for a cure. I want to be cured, fix me. That immediately puts the analyst in a certain position as the doctor, as the mechanic, as the one who can fix. That is the subject supposed to know. So Noah, I think the answer to your question is that status as a knowledgeable doctor who can fix it all, a wizard type even, is extremely useful at the start of an analysis. It may be the only thing that keeps the analysand coming back. And if it continues, if the analyst can't drop that role, it becomes one of the hindrances to the ending of an analysis. So you think that analysis goes on interminably because the analysand gets hystericized and keeps finding new answers to the cause of their symptom. And they just keep talking. Oh, I had another dream last night, doctor. Let's talk through it. And it goes on forever. No, man, it's because the analyst won't let go of knowledge, won't allow themselves to be what they truly are, in what Lacan calls, and this is his only real communist moment, sorry for y'all, a brotherhood with the analysand. He thinks that a good analyst establishes brotherhood and sisterhood with the analysand. There's a bond between them. And the bond is we are both pieces of shit. That is fundamentally. Do you think subjective destitution at the end of analysis is just for the analysand? No. The reason why analysts get $500 an hour is because how would you like to be the piece of shit day in and day out? Nobody wants to play that part. It's a miserable place to be. This is why Lacan titled Seminar 19 "or worse." What's worse than being a piece of shit is refusing to accept that truth about oneself. That's what "or worse" means. He says bad analysts yearn for worse. In fact, if you want to translate it from the French, Badiou's got a good riff on this. It's to yerson. An analyst that clings to knowledge is one who is always yersoning, yearning for something worse than shit. And that is glory. That is knowledge. That is authority. That's what's worse. What's worse than destitution is its denial, is its resistance. That for Lacan is just, that sums it up in a nutshell. So Noah, transference onto subjects supposed to know, great at the start of an analysis, but if it continues forever and the analysand develops a worshipful relation to the analyst as philosopher king, that's a bad situation for a neurotic to be in, because all they've really found now is the big other that in truth doesn't exist. Louise.
Yeah. So when you were talking about the object A as the trash leftover, I wonder how is that similar or different from the free association of the analysand, right? And how we can maybe formalize that in the analyst discourse, right?
Yes, brilliant.
Yeah.
Yes, you're correct. So the piece of shit that pops up in free association is the slip, is the stumble, the forgetting, the lapsus, what we typically would treat as an error of discourse, of speech, is in analysis the primary object of inquiry. I don't care what you dreamt about. I care about the difference between the story you told me about the dream last week and how you're describing the dream this week. What matters to me is the error or the slip in your narrations between two sessions. Notice this, like in psychoanalysis, what looks like garbage is in fact the designated object of study, the slip or the error. And that comes with free association. I mean, some people will say, Louise, as you probably know, that the goal of analysis is just to get to the point where an analysand can freely associate. I mean, have you ever tried this? Have you ever tried free association? That shit is, that's not natural. That is some very difficult action to make your tongue do. It is a very tricky place to be in a freely associative state. That's why some people are like, hey, as soon as you start free associating an analysis, you're done, baby. You've got it all down, because now you have the ability to sense and to produce over and over again the truth of the speech that makes you a subject. garbage, error and slippage. This is what Lacan means by la langue. La language, all that shit that he gets into in the 1970s, he is describing the sonic relationships between words like to write with your hand and to do it right, with a sense of righteousness. He's saying, whoa, there's a sonic connection between writing and being right. What's that about? That doesn't show up in the dictionary. You can look up the word W-R-I-T-E and you will not see a reference to the word R-I-G-H-T. In the unconscious, however, they're homies. They smoke joints together behind the Safeway. Right and right are homies in the unconscious. And when you free associate, you allow for those really wild and weird connections. Right, 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 right. So part of what I always do in sessions like these where we're hanging out and just really kind of like unfurling is, you've probably noticed, and I have to always apologize for this for those of you for whom English is a second language. I move purposefully, very quickly between like conceptual points to curse words, really quickly from weird examples to drawn out images, like two words that sound the same smoking a joint behind a grocery store. The whole goal is to allow those flitting thoughts that everybody's mind has find a way into speech in all of those weird like disjoints. So I mean, the most flattering thing I could even imagine was being Joyced at the start of this when Daniel was like, "Oh, here we go." I was like, "Fucking great, man! I haven't even said anything yet. We're already Joyced." Notice this is also why in seminar 23, Lacan focuses so intensely on James Joyce. Because in Joyce's staving off of psychosis, by literally rewriting the entire English language, he's not just able to preserve his basic, very minimal sense of belonging in a world by recreating it because he's staving off psychosis, but he also shows us in writing what's happening in free association. Right and right are indeed smoking a joint behind the Safeway in Finnegan's Wake. So I think it's important to have that in mind. And I think Louise's point is a really, really good one here. In analysis, what is produced is trash. And notice in the analytic discourse that Louise queued up, that is symbolized by S1, which I told you was a master discourse. Only in the analytic discourse does S1 reveal itself to be something of the two, not the one. We'll come to that if we can get to it. But in analytic discourse, that S1 is a symptom. And a symptom is an error. It's a slip. It's a lapsus that is commanded by the unconscious. But notice, Louise is precisely right. It is a piece of trash. Everywhere in your life, hear me now, everywhere in your life, the symptom is a piece of trash, except in therapy. In analysis, shit turns to gold. Daniel, what's up?
I just wanted to say I really love this, and it's so great to have you here. And one thing I just wanted to pinpoint that has already opened up chasms of like clarity for me and maybe for others is the focus that you've given us to the delta symbol.
Yeah.
In the sense that when I'm looking, I'm looking at a, portrayal of the four discourses, and I'm looking at the bottom point of impossibility of each one, and then I place the delta there. Like, I don't mean to sound cliche, but like a light bulb goes off for me, because then I see the impotence, the point of impotence, and then I see at the bottom of the quadrants the product and the truth and the delta in between. And then when you apply that delta in between to each four, and maybe we could even start to sort of throw all of them up so we can do that.
Exactly what I was about to do.
It might be a nice transition. I felt that was like the key. And it's just so funny that so many expositors of Lacanian thought and the discourse theory, they don't mention the delta. It's kind of a big deal.
They don't. It's truly remarkable to me. And I sometimes think like, am I fucking crazy? It is Lacan is all over this. How can this not be the point of concern and of conversation? I think once you see these 4 discourses up on the board, you can see why the temptation is so strong to get into these variables and all 4 of the discourses and to really start just obsessing about them and losing sight of this other key piece. So let's do this work. Thank you, Daniel, of drawing first and foremost the master's discourse. And because we're going to do this right, every chance I get, I'm going to try and use a different color to show you, remind you what we got here. So this is the master's discourse. And before we talk through any of the details of this, I want to just show you some stuff. Do you see all 4 of the variables that we discussed? See the S1, the S2, the little a, and all that shit? Okay. If you take those 4 variables and you give them a quarter turn, so S slashed pops up, S1 moves over, S2 drops down, and little a slides to the left. Do you see this? By simply giving the master a quarter turn, think of it as a nudge, you produce the hysteric. Now, this matters analytically because analysans are tempted to play master. I'm the consumer. I'm paying for this. Fix me, slave. Use your knowledge to create a cure. You see, I'm the patient. You're the knowledgeable doctor. S2 equals knowledge. Give me a cure. Tell me what my disorder is. Now you can see why so many therapists resort to the DSM, because it always gives you a name for somebody's issue that you can then sell back to them as a commodity. In analysis, though, what you want to do is give those masters a nudge. You want to give them a nudge. In other words, you want to hystericize the master. Instead of having them speak from a position of authority, you want to actually have them speak from the position of truth, which is barred subjectivity. This is why when dealing with neurotics, you don't focus on the fluid aspects of their speech. You focus on what Louise rightly noted as the little detritus. You don't focus on the great things that they said about themselves. You focus on the stammer in between. You focus on impotence, not where they are powerful, but where they are weak. That's one of the ways that you hystericize the analysan. But notice, it's a quarter turn. Similarly, give the hysteric a quarter turn. So A pops up, slashed S moves to the right, S1 drops down, S2 slides left. Here what you now have is the discourse of the analyst. All just being produced by quarter turns. And you know, Lacan starts with the discourse of the analyst. You can start with any of the ones you like, and you can give them quarter turns. Let's just keep with it. Give the analytic discourse a quarter turn, and now you suddenly have the university discourse. And because we want to be true to Daniel's insight, which is also my own, brother, yeah, when this delta starts popping, I'm like, holy shit. I remember too, when I was getting into this, like, wow, this is totally the coolest part of the whole thing. Okay, so these are all 4 of the classic discourses. I imagine that given your group's interest, maybe the capitalist discourse is the most interesting to you. It's also the easiest, thank God. We can talk about it in a minute, but let's work with these for now. First and foremost, notice the sequential ordering that I told you was one of the 3 or 4 points you had to know about discourse. These terms rotate, these variables They rotate through the formulas in exactly the same order. None steps out of order. Even in the capitalist discourse, the sequential ordering of the four basic variables remains. And you know what else doesn't move? The delta of impotence. It is there in every single discourse. And it serves as a barrier. In fact, I often tell my undergraduates, think of this as a mountain. It's a mountain range that S2 has a hard time crossing. The master has a hard time seeing the connection between the object that they think will make them whole and the fact of incompletion that drives them towards that object. Now look very carefully at the bottom of the master's discourse. What do you see? You see a broken formula for fantasy. The Lacanian formula for fantasy is precisely what the master cannot see. They cannot see that they are a castrated, limited, and constrained subject in search of some surplus to pele, fill them in. They don't see it that way. The master is blind to the fantasy that structures his existence. The hysteric is blind to a different kind of fantasy. In the analytic discourse, there is no connection between the part of truth that can be said and the part that cannot. You've heard this from me before. And in the university discourse, these poor fucking students ever sundered from the very symptom of their existence. So we can go on and on, but I want all four of them to be up here first. Notice the sequential ordering of the four variables. Each follows a very certain path. S1 to S2 to A to barred subject to S1 to S2 to A. That's really important. Lacan doesn't think you can stray from their sequential ordering. I don't think it's the most important part in all this. What I would emphasize in each of these discourses is the S1. There's a relation to oneness in each case that I think we have to earn. I think we could earn it here this morning. I think we could do it. Let me ask you all something. Would it be useful for me to just go quickly through each discourse and like give you like an example of each? Okay, people are saying yes. Okay, so let's just do that. Andrew, hold up for a second, unless you've got a 15-second jump in that you want to add.
No, oh, it's pertaining to the master's discourse, but I could hold it for a bit.
Okay, yeah, let's do the master's first, and if it's still with you and you think it's really relevant, jump in.
Mhm.
Okay, so the master's discourse is a very classic one. It's one that I'm sure you've seen and that you've discussed before. Some people say that, like chapter 3 of the phenomenology of spirit is really where we get this, and I don't really know. I don't really care. But I think what matters for Lacan is that this is the first discourse that he formulates, even though the analytic discourse is the centerpiece. And remember how he does it. He formulates it out of his definition of the signifier. The signifier is what represents a subject to another signifier. He repeats this over and over again in the 60s. And in seminar 16 is where it really culminates, this definition. If you've seen our series, you know it's more or less centered around this definition of the signifier, our series on 16. In 17, he adds this little a to produce what he calls a four-footed animal. I like this as a four-footed animal. But he says this is the master's discourse. And here's how it works. Someone who purports to be the one, the boss, the authority, the one who speaks and everybody snaps into action, commands another, someone with knowledge of, I don't know, how to bake a cake. The master is the one who commands the other to mobilize their knowledge for the production of something the master desires. It could be a cake. Bake me a cake, use your knowledge of baking to produce something that I can then consume. Now, there are lots of complexities. We could spend days, and you can see our series, like there's a lot you can say about each of these discourses. A very important one here is that a good slave for the master is one who anticipates the master's desire before the master says it. Think about this as a fantasy. Newton is out there playing tennis, and Jeeves, just as the match ends, walks up with a tray full of lemonade. And Newton says to Jeeves, "Oh my God, aren't you the best slave? How did you know that it was lemonade that I would want at the end of this?" This is one of the basic dilemmas of the master. If they do their job right, they will produce a relationship to the other where the other is anticipating the master's desire to such an extent that the master never experiences lack. You see, that's exactly what the master can't bear, is the fact that they are a lacking divided subject. So it purports with the discourse of the master that the master would look for slaves who can anticipate their desire before the master even feels it. Because if the master feels desire, that is very much like a split subject, desirous subject. The dilemma, though, is one that puts us right on the edge of clinical depression. A good slave is one that prevents desire. A master is one who wakes up in the morning and doesn't know what the fuck to do, doesn't want to do anything. And if you ask me, this is the basic definition of power in late modernity. In the old days, juridical power was what you could make somebody do with the barrel of a gun. It was about forcing action. I think in our era, being powerful means not having to act. Power means you can wake up in the morning and not do shit and still be rich at the end of the day. Notice too how this is the basic symptomatology of lower downwardly mobile classes and higher 1%ers of the world. If you're in the lower class, you can wake up in the morning and not do shit and still be broke at the end of the day. You're still in that same class. When you're wealthy, you can do the same goddamn thing. You can wake up in the morning, not do shit, and still be rich at the end. Hence the fantasy of the middle class. If I don't wake up and get to work, I'll slide into the lower class. But if I do, maybe I can become a 1%er. So you might see this as the basic middle class fantasy that has created these two realities for lower and upper class subjects. The master is the one who fancies themselves the upper class subject, ever looking for slaves who can produce cakes before the master even wants one, and as a result can quell any experience of lack. That's the weird part about the master. The master wants nothing more than the cessation of his own desire and is ever in search of slaves, partners, friends, jobs, neighbors who can do that work. The master's discourse is terrific in many ways. It allows much to be taken apart. The effect of it is a commodity for the master's consumption, but the cause of it, the cause and condition of the master's illusion of oneness and authority, is division, weakness, castration. In fact, better than understanding /s as split subject, I would read it as castration, meaning division, limitation, and constraint. The truth that the master cannot bear about themselves is that they are in fact constrained, that they are in fact limited like the rest of us. Now, we can get into all of this shit in detail. Is that enough on the master's discourse for us to move on? Or do you want more? I'm happy to focus wherever there's interest.
No, I think it's really good. I mean, obviously, there's a lot to say regarding the chapter on lordship and bondage from Hegel. I mean,
That's right.
There's that, because Hegel, though, is a thinker of the university discourse and of the precisely the I mean, we talk about him in Masters. I think he's more there, though, precisely because Hegel, according to Lacan, resolves the fact that the Enlightenment does not produce a resolution to the split subjectivity of the scholar. Right?
That's great. Yeah,
Right?
totally.
But
Yeah.
Hegel does, right? Hegel finds a way around that, which is why Hegel regales the scholar, which it goes back to shame, because the production of the university discourse, which we'll get to, is actually quite miserable if you look at it. It's terrible. The the subjective outcome of it is bollocks. It's not good. We'll get to that.
Leave
But
it. Listen,
yeah.
y'all, leave it to your professors to tell you this. We'll tell you the truth. Daniel,
Yeah.
sorry, I just had to put that little footnote in.
Well, that's
Continue,
why it's
please.
so interesting that throughout 17, what you know, that reference Lacan is always making to the first dissertation written about Jacques Lacan by Annika Lemaire, which was entitled
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is very interesting because Lacan says, and we were just reading this as a group, the whole basis of the dissertation proceeds on an error in Lacan's very definition of the unconscious. But ultimately, within the circulation of the system of the university, that doesn't quite matter, because what really matters is the scholar making a name for themselves, is what Lacan will say.
Hey, there it is.
Anyways, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I think that's very helpful, unless others have questions on Master's Discourse.
Yeah, and it raises the question of our absolute master, as some idiot once referred to Lacan as the absolute master. What a fucking fool. Pardon my French here.
It is always you're talking about Rudinesco's. It's very strange.
She's among them. She's the great inheritor of this kind of ridiculous treatment of Lacan as the master. And I just don't understand. I mean, first of all, I don't like Jacques Lacan. Let me be very clear about this. I don't want to hang out with him. Like, if you're giving me a time machine, I'm not going back in time to hang out with Jacques Lacan. I am not fucking with that dude. I don't want to be his friend. Maybe I would want him to be my analyst if I hadn't already been analyzed. Maybe, no, I read him as a world historical thinker. And I don't fuck with thinkers that aren't that. Lacan is that. Hegel is that. These are figures whose work is difficult, but whose work is fundamentally profound and epoch shifting. I think that about Lacan. I could say that about lots of different people whom I've studied in the past. Heidegger also, we can go down the whole list. Hannah Arendt is a world historical thinker. But Lacan's thought is fabulous. As a person, the way that he conducts himself around, for instance, the first dissertation written about Lacan, he was just he had a little tiny, like, psychoanalyst boner about that dissertation. He's just so excited whenever anyone's talking about him. There's this scene where he had a coffee cup that was shaped like a tooth, and he accidentally breaks the coffee cup, and he shows up at his next seminar and he's like, I had this coffee cup. I'm going to do it with a Donald Trump accent, if you don't mind, because Donald Trump and Jacques Lacan have very similar communicative styles. Anyone who loves me, who knows me, will also want to buy me a new coffee cup. And I will do what I can't do the Trump thing for much longer than that. But what Lacan says is, he says, everybody who loves me, buy me a new coffee cup. And then what I will do is I will take the one I like the most and keep it. And the rest I will smash in the courtyard outside my office, which is all the courtyard is for. There's this kind of cultivation of worship, of, I don't know about mastery, but he has a kind of sense that I think he cultivates a cult-like fandom around him.
Yeah.
And Miller was just the worst of these fucking
You're totally right. Although there's one redeeming thing I really love, this play about Lacan called Lacan's Parrot by Betty Milan, which was turned into a film recently. Which is, well, no, there's one redemptive thing, right? Because if you watch the play or the film, it's a narrative about an immigrant Brazilian Portuguese woman who comes to Paris and seeks analysis with Lacan. and she had a very traumatic experience with her father. And the long and short of it is like Lacan ends up intervening in a crisis moment for this analyst in a way that is like ultra compassionate and you sort of and brilliant. Like his intervention saved her life. And at that moment, I'm like, okay, that's redemptive for Lacan. I'll accept that.
Like I said, maybe you'd want him as your analyst. There are too many good
Right.
stories of him walking across the room and just touching his hand on the cheek, right? And saying, Gestapo, right? And suddenly you're like, holy fuck, that's kind of genius. Kind of weird, right? Like analysts, you don't want to be touching your analyst's hands. But sometimes the move is that and truly compassionate. I mean, I think genuinely he was probably a very good analyst. And I think his primary struggle was what it meant to become a teacher of psychoanalysis. I think that for him was the great professional dilemma of his life that drove everything that we now have as this Lacanian text. It's driven fundamentally by his inability to reconcile being an analyst and being a teacher of psychoanalysis. In fact, when asked, what are you performing when you teach? He's always going to say, I'm showing up as the analysand. My job is to show you in my performances on stage what it's like to be an analysand. Freely associating, saying weird shit that doesn't make sense. This was his basic MO as a teacher. And I really admire that. I feel like he got so deep in the struggle of distinguishing himself from the professor, well, that we got the university discourse beyond the analytic discourse.
Right.
But it was his struggle. I think
Well,
as an
I
analyst,
I
he was
also want
probably
to
great.
say, Sam, first of all, since we are all Lacanians and we know one of Lacan's great teachings is what's called scansion, we also know about punctuality, and it is Sunday, and I do want to say this for you, Sam, as our teacher today, that we can find a time to close soon, and maybe even a follow-up, given how rich and amazing this, and I'm not exaggerated, like this is amazing, really, really awesome. Maybe in the future we could do something in maybe in the new year as well. But I have
Yeah, for
time,
sure.
but maybe we can also, because we are over 2 hours for your benefit as well.
Well, how long do you guys usually go?
We are pretty crazy like you. There's no limits. I would say we usually go for 2 hours, but we can go a little further. I mean, um, it's up to you. You're totally in. I just wanted to also give
Are
you
you
permission
sure
that
you
you
want to
you can
leave it up to
stop.
me? Are you sure you want to leave it up
I
to
am
me?
sure, actually.
I did mention that slop jar underneath my grandfather's Cadillac seat, right? I mean, I don't take pee breaks. I mean, our sessions, we go like 4 or 5 hours. Okay, but we're not
Do
gonna do
you really? Oh my
we do.
God.
Yeah,
Okay.
but we're not gonna do that.
Okay.
We're not gonna do that. So let me just sorry, Andrew, but we gotta cut forward here. Um, let me provide you with a bumper sticker for each discourse. And we'll leave it at that. And if you want to drill down on the hysteric or the analyst or the university, I'm happy to do that. Here is the bumper sticker for each that I would like you all to take with you. It all comes down to the relationship in each discourse to this S1. And forgive me, but I'm the kind of person that likes to talk about things that I'm thinking about at present. I'm never just here teaching things that I think are like useful to you. I'm also teaching stuff that for me is an active mode of inquiry that I don't fully understand. So here's my understanding of the S1 in these discourses that I think cuts to the bone of each. In the master's discourse, what we see is the following bumper sticker. There is oneness and I am it. That is what the master says. This S1, this agent, says the same thing over and over again. There is oneness and I am it. If you want to write it down and figure it out later, but this is the truth of each. The hysteric addresses S1, a master, and says, there is oneness and you're not it. That is what the hysteric says over and over again. There is oneness and you are not it. This is why the hysteric is the basic figure of the protester. Even of the great scientist as well.
But the key interesting thing there, Sam, is that they still insist that there's oneness.
That's exactly it. And that's the basic, that's why the hysteric is always on the verge of perversion. You see, the pervert is the one who says there is oneness and I can help you get there. I can make you whole. I can provide you, big other, with what has been subtracted, jouissance. I can give you jouissance. Let me be the instrument of your enjoyment, the pervert says. Let me be the thing that plugs your hole and makes you full. So you see, the hysteric admits that there is oneness, but denies it constantly from coming to fruition. The hysteric is the one that says, there is oneness, you're not it, but you would be if I allowed you to have me. But I will never allow you to have me. I will only ever be a lack in your life. The truth of the hysteric's discourse is, I will be the cause of your desire, but never the condition of its fulfillment. That's why objet a in the hysteric's discourse is in the position of truth. The truth of the hysteric is, I will cause your desire, but never fulfill it. There is oneness. You're not it. You might be if I gave myself to you, but I will not. So the hysteric is the one who always believes in oneness and denies its fruition. So I think that's great, Daniel. Okay. In the case of the university, the bumper sticker goes like this, and we can label this as philosopher. The university's discourse relationship to the one is this. There is oneness, and I'm not it. That is what the university says. That is what the philosopher turned professor never shuts up about. And all the more so when they purport to be radical catalysts of social change. There is oneness, and I'm not it. So check this out. The master says, there is oneness, and I'm it. The university says there is oneness and I'm not it because I'm not power. All the while, the university discourse is ignorant of the fact that it's the state of California that cuts their checks every month. Similarly, the hysteric also believes in the one. There is oneness and you're not it. Neither are you, professor. You see? Nobody of these three figures doubts that there is oneness. Everyone believes there is oneness. They just disagree on who embodies it. That's the way these discourses work. In the case of the analyst, you get the following. There is no such thing as oneness. Even and especially when we say the opposite. That's the difference here. The S1 in the discourse of the analyst is the symptom that always says, I'm not it. The symptom says the same thing over and over again. I'm not it. Because I'm not the unconscious. I'm commanded by the unconscious, but I am not the unconscious. You must look elsewhere for the truth that commanded me into existence, the symptom says. So in other words, the symptom, the S1 in the analytic discourse always shows up and says, there are two. There is me, the part of truth that can be said. And then there is this other part of truth, represented by S2, divided by a mountain range, that cannot be said. So the S1 in the analytic discourse always says there's two. and I am not the one on which to focus. I am just a little tip of an iceberg, if you want to think of it that way. But that's the dilemma of analytic experience, is how do you take the symptomatic statements of the analysand and dialectize them, allow them to come into conversation with the unconscious truths that commanded them into existence by this trajectory. Unconscious truth commands the barred subject to speak, and when they open their mouths, they produce a symptom. This symptom then becomes the thing on which the analyst is tempted to get off on as a figure of surplus enjoyment. Somehow the analyst has to use that energy instead to command the analysand to speak again. Say it again, say it better. But this circuit is that of analytic experience. If it goes well, it'll hystericize the analysand. It'll cause them to address their symptom and put it into conversation with unconscious truth. It's another way to read the hysterics discourse. You see, I gave you the social reading of the hysterics discourse to start. Here's the protester who challenges power, forces them to admit that they are lacking, that they are ignorant, ignorance being an elaborate form of knowledge. Don't forget that. In analytic experience, though, the hysteric is a properly hystericized patient who speaks from a position of castration, addresses their symptomatic statements, and forces those statements to confess where they came from, unconscious truth. Notice what's happened here. By hystericizing the analysand, the analyst has been able to overcome, or at least to circumvent, the mountain range that previously divided the symptomatic statement from the unconscious truth that commanded it. So the hysterics discourse is a great one because it allows for all these different readings. Lacan's foremost reading of it is always clinical. A hystericized analysand is great, but all too often that's where psychoanalysis ends. You think that just because you're in there talking through your symptoms, you've arrived at something, and you show up every day with a new symptom to discuss. The end of analysis, though, is when your symptoms stop being related to you in particular. They end with what Colette Soler calls a genericity. Symptoms become generic at the end of analysis. All you have at the end is the generous and generic symptom of sex, the generous and generic symptom of castration, which ain't got shit to do with you. That is subjective destitution. Your symptom has nothing to do with you. That thing that you thought was the most personal, intimate detail of your existence, for Lacan at the end of analysis, I mean, Soler is right about this. It ain't got nothing to do with you. The basic symptom that structures our existence, each of us, is just the sheer fact that we can speak it. It's a linguistic effect that applies to all who speak. It ain't got nothing to do with you. Now you can let go. Now you're able to move out of analysis, I think. So there's a connection between each of these. And this will be my final word on the topic, and then we can talk for as long as you all want, or we can scan it, whatever you want to do. Final word on this topic is that these discourses have relationships to each other. And this is going to be another one that you might just want to write down and think about later, but there are relationships here, and I think they're quite relevant. Here's how I would put it. You can rotate through these discourses clockwise, in a sense. When the master's discourse gives way to the hysteric, you have true progress. A good analysand who might show up a master and become hystericized. That's good for neurotic subjects in analysis. When masters become hysterics in the clinic, that's good if they're neurotic. Check it out, though. When the analyst becomes the university in the clinic, however, that is bad. That is false progress. because here you now have the analyst playing professor. That is not good for therapy. So note this, masters becoming hysterics, that's great if you're an analysand. Analysts becoming universities, not good if you're an analyst. Notice how this works though when you flip it around. When the university discourse gives way to that of the analyst, that is good. That is a false regress. It's actually a true move. And notice what I'm doing here. I guess I should be more explicit about this. All I'm doing is taking the 4 terms and shifting them a quarter turn. So when you take the university discourse and you move all 4 of those terms counterclockwise, it looks like a regression, right? It looks like things are going backwards. Think of it on the face of a clock. If I move 2 o'clock to 10 o'clock, it looks like a regress. It's not. It's a false regress. From university to analyst, a quarter turn is actually progress. This is an analyst who is able to let go of knowledge, who no longer has to be the know-it-all, and can put themselves on the path to abjection instead. And what I just told you about master to hysteric, notice how I'm getting that. I told you that it was productive. It's a clockwise turn that gave us the hysteric. You take the master's discourse and you force whoever is occupying it, you just give them a clockwise turn. That's good business. But notice it's just about turning the terms and shifting where they are. What happens when the hysteric becomes the master? That, my friends, is a true regression. See, we're going back in time. S1 shifts to the left, barred subject drops down. The hystericized analysand, if they slip back into mastery, that is a form of regression. That is not the forward step that we want them to make. I think that's an important move here. So in each case, you can take these discourses and give them a quarter turn clockwise or counterclockwise. And when you give them a quarter turn, you either see an illusion of progress or genuine progress. And when you turn them counterclockwise, you either see an illusion of regress or a genuine regression. I told you that Lacan has these 4 variables, which gives us 4 discourses. The important part in the final analysis is their interdiscursive relation. That was the final bullet point that I told you you needed to understand to really get with Lacan on discourse. It's not about the structure. It's not about the variables. It's not about how the variables move. It's about how all 4 of these discourses merge into each other. And you can think about how to get somebody from one to the other. If you're dating a hysteric, be happy when they don't slide into mastery. You see what I'm saying? If you're dating the university, be happy when they don't progress into mastery. Anyway, that's a long story short. Let's open the floor. Daniel.
Sam, would it be possible to get the bumper sticker on the cap on the 5th discourse quickly, maybe? And would that be okay?
Yeah.
I'm just dying to hear how you say there is oneness in the capitalist discourse. I'll be really, anyways, sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So here's how you get the capitalist discourse. Take the master's discourse in your 2 hands. So imagine yourself reaching into your notes and you pull out the master's discourse and you've got it. In your right hand, you've got S2 and little a. In your left hand, you've got S1 and barred subject. And what you want to do is take your left hand and twist that motherfucker upside down. When you twist the master's discourse, and you might even say the master's discourse is proto-capitalist. When you take the master's discourse and you twist the left-hand side, you break the arrow of addressivity. That is shattered. It snaps loose in order for you to make the twist. Barred subject comes up. S1 goes down here. The arrow is reversed. You see, if you take the left side of the master's discourse and you just flip it upside down, this is what you get. One drops down, barred subject pops up, and the arrow reverses course. Everything else remains the same. So also do these vectors. What you get now is what Lacan playfully refers to. It depends on how you translate roulette, I think, but this is fundamentally a go-kart race. You get a circuit. The one thing that you didn't have in the other discourses was a four-part circuit. Here, though, in the capitalist discourse, there's this endless flow. Notice the flow. It looks like an infinity symbol when you draw this thing out. And there's a reason for that, because this shit goes on forever. I would dare say this is maybe the only thing that Marx couldn't fully figure out, was that there would in fact be something called interminable capitalism. We might call it late capitalism, but I'm damn certain Marx thought. Marx was basically a great Christian. You see, the early Christians always thought, should I get another loaf of bread at the store? No, baby, Jesus is coming back. He'll be here next week. Christianity is just an eschatological stretch out. It's a constant deferral of end times. Jesus is always on his way. That's the history of Christianity. Every generation thought Jesus was on the way. Capitalism, I think, is the same. It's this kind of endless eschatological stretch out. This is what we learned, what I learned at least, about late capitalism. It has this unique ability to co-opt any form of resistance and revolution and turn it into one more leather jacket at Urban Outfitters. This endless ability to commodify social change, to sell it back. I mean, think about this. In the 1960s, men grew their hair long in the United States. By the 70s, every straight guy destined to be an accountant had long hair. In the 1980s, gay men in my town pierced their right ears. By the 1990s, my hippy-dippy brother had both his ears pierced. Blue jeans used to be the marker of lower class working life. And then Marlon Brando and James Dean got a hold of them. And suddenly they became fashionable. The t-shirt was the thing that went under a shirt, again, until those white dudes started rolling up smokes in them. Now suddenly t-shirts are not an undershirt, but in fact the very thing that defines mainstream existence. It's not a signal of work. The way blue jeans aren't a signal of work either. I know because we just elected the Levi inheritor to the mayor of San Francisco. So we're all up in it with these billionaires who have learned to commodify symbols of working class existence. Long story short, the capitalist discourse works like this. The barred S up here is the dissatisfied consumer. We'll talk about why they're dissatisfied in a moment. And they find a shiny new object. S1 is indeed the figure of mastery here. And Daniel, you asked what the one bumper sticker here is. It's there is oneness, and this might be it. Every commodity is the one that promises to be the final commodity. This is the one. This is the true one. That's why so many marketers of high-end leather boots will tell you things like, this is the last pair of boots you're ever going to buy. This is the commodity of commodities. But let me tell you what happens when you spend $200 on a pair of leather boots that are the last boots you're ever going to buy from Tasmania. You take those boots home, and before you know it, they're in a basket full of all the other shoes you own. That's what S2 is in the capitalist discourse. It's all the other commodities that promised to be the one, but now just sit in a basket of shoes by your front door. This is the dilemma of the capitalist discourse, is every shiny new object eventually finds its way into a pile. Hear me now, a pile of shit. S2 here is all the other shiny new objects that have gone on to become pieces of shit. So, for instance, go to your closet. When we're done here, go to your closet, open your closet, take a look at all that shit in your bedroom closet, all that clothing, and see if you can remember when that shirt, the one that you know, was new. You got that shirt, it was new. You planned a whole fucking party at your house just so you could wear that shirt. It was the shirt that woke you up early that day. You were so excited to wear that shirt. Now it just sits in your closet, damn near on its way to the Goodwill. The nature of the commodity in the capitalist discourse, Lacan suggests, is every shiny new object eventually gets into a basket with all the other old shit that used to be shiny new and becomes inadequate. The shininess wears off. And what is produced, notice what I'm doing here, what is produced when the shiny new object finds its way into the basket of shoes by your front door, or the shiny new shirt finds its way into your closet with all the other old shit, is that you are left feeling inadequate. You experience lack. This reanimates the dissatisfaction that the consumer initially had when they went online to buy the boots in the first place. This is the circuit of capitalism as Lacan sees it. A dissatisfied consumer finds a shiny new object, the luster of which eventually rubs off, leaving the consumer feeling dissatisfied again. Here, little a is an object cause of desire. And that dissatisfaction animates further consumption. That is the circuit that I was talking about, this infinity roulette wheel of sorts. Really, it's more like a go-kart track. Think of it like that. And it just keeps going. That's the capitalist discourse as I think Lacan sees it. There are some complexities here that we haven't talked much about. But I think for now, I think it might be good enough to start the conversation on capitalism with this discourse. I'm glad, Daniel, that you brought it up.
Incredible stuff. I mean, I want to turn to Andrew, Jordan, Luis, and others, but I mean, it just, I think there's a sort of question regarding Lacanian scholarship as to what extent does the later Lacan, once we get to the seminar on Joyce in particular, actually sort of feel that modern society is sort of dominated, or that the fifth discourse is hegemonic. And I know that I think in like Malaire's school, they sort of, in my reading, they do believe that it is, which is why you get these notions of Lacan saying that like sublimation is over, or that modern capitalism no longer has the propensity or the capacity to generate a belief in the unconscious, which is les non-dupes errant, like the whole crisis of psychoanalysis as an institution comes into play. Because one of the weird things that goes on here is that castration is not eligible to be resolved. And so one of the things that is other than through this, so it's kind of like, if from 16, Pascal identifies a moment in capitalism where the market becomes absolutized, and he becomes like a saint who provides, through the theory of the wager, a solution to handle the alienation, which is ultimately an alienation about the loss of belief as well. What does Lacan say about the way to rival or contest the fifth discourse? He says only a saint can do it. And so he then puts forward a theory which is very pessimistic. And this is something that I've written about, Sam, about like Lacanian Marxism, quote unquote. And even like saying like Slavoj Žižek's work, there's a lot to be gleaned and talked about here about, okay, yeah, Lacan's basically showing that how thorough alienation really is, or how inescapable it is in some sense. And that's obviously very valuable, but we don't get much prescription. We don't get much. So I've always thought about that, how to work with these insights in a way that doesn't lead us down a road of a pure dejection or a pure pessimism, regarding the dominance of capitalism. But I want to turn to others. That's just one little brief reflection.
Hold on a second, though. I love others too, but Daniel, this is just great. And the reason why I say this is great is I'm selfish because it's just great for me because you're really opening my eyes to something. So, as I mentioned at the start of this, I'm just starting to read television. And so this is an interview that Lacan did in 1973. And he's got this really weird bit in here about the saint. This is one of the first places that I've seen him really offer something profound about sainthood. So in Seminar 20, Lacan, which is just before this, in Seminar 20, Lacan is really hot on the mystics. He thinks like a mystical presence, whether it's Saint Teresa or John of the Cross. Lacan even calls himself a mystic in this sense of being able to express something beyond the phallic field. The mystic has got his brain wired. Here, though, just a few months later, he turns to the saint and he says the logic of the saint is not caritas, but trashitas, trash, detritus. I'm serious. It's totally legit. It's on page 15 of this book for those of you that are already in the mix on this one. He says, a saint's business, to put it clearly, is not caritas. Rather, he acts as trash, his business being trashitas. And then he ends by answering the question, of what is the saint a piece of trash? He says, the saint is the refuse of jouissance. I love this as this is one of the most interesting things I've heard in a very long time. The saint as refuse of jouissance, as perhaps the very and only position that might be able to bring late capitalism to an end, or at least the capitalist discourse.
Right.
Daniel, I want to put this back to you. I know we've got other questions, but it's too irresistible to me to be able to pick your brain about this. What do you think about this image that you've brought up as the saint, as the figure that could trouble, terribly perhaps, capitalism?
Well, I mean, we should always remember that the Saint Home is a homophony of Saint Tom, Saint Thomas Aquinas. And this idea of Saint Tom's love of theoria, if in late capitalism for Lacan, there's this interminable problem of belief in the unconscious and the kind of roulette table that goes on to infinity, and that the symptom itself has the status of this stickiness that cannot be fully overcome, and the problem of the end of analysis and all of that. I have been thinking more that, like, philosophically, Lacan, as that short period of time where he flirts with Marx, gave Lacan the rudiments, the sources conceptually to think psychoanalysis in a way that was perhaps more revolutionary than the direction that he ends up taking. I think the theory of the Saint-Home and the late clinic, the Joycean insights, all of that are fabulous and very interesting. I do at the same time, Sam, worry about what I have referred to as because, if I'm committed to something like, the Freudian Marxist tradition, right, I will confess that therefore I want to extend psychoanalysis to the project of Marxism. And the project of Marxism, I think, needs to enter into the arena of allowing us a modality by which we can actually think rupture, change, revolution. So one of the things I worry about is that, the totality, or the what Lukács, the great Marxist philosopher, calls reification, right? Lacan's giving us this theory ultimately of reification.
Brilliant.
In the fifth discourse, and it's very valuable.
Yeah.
But what I worry about is the question of how how to get out of it, and the fact that only a saint can get out of it is not a great prospect for
There's the
like
answer.
socialism.
There's the answer.
Maybe that is like the precipice of what Lacan's inviting us as Marxists to think, and I need to interrogate it further, and that's, I think, what draws me to Lacan. But I have written about how it's very funny that a lot of Marxists stop reading Lacan about the late post-Encore period of Lacan, because that's when Lacan himself kind of abandons Marxism in a certain way. So those are some thoughts for you, but I'd be very curious what others think, because there's also a lot of folks that are interested in Marx on here too.
I believe it. That's partly why I'm so eager to pick brains about this one.
Yeah.
I think that the bit on reification is really, really crucial here. I think in the early 1970s, Lacan is thinking about what it means to objectify. I think he really is thinking about this in a more broader sense. I think what he's up to around masculine and feminine enjoyment is the masculine position is a reifying position. It's a position that gets off on thingifying complex multiplicities. Lacan's entire theory of sexuation is about what remains after thingification. And I think the Marxist tradition I was just trying to think if there was a better one. I think the Marxist tradition around commodity production, and I mean, the fact that you could have tables with enough labor built into them that they could get up and dance across the floor.
Right.
This kind of Fantasia model that I think Deleuze and Guattari really made a lot of. It's not 1,000 plateaus, right? It's always just been 1,000 turntables, dancing tables. That's what the whole thing's about. But I feel like the Marxist tradition is the only one that could take seriously the Lacanian turn towards objectification of others, the reduction of one's partners to parts that we think make us feel whole, and what remains. What remains in as an excess built into the commodity. I think that I feel that some early 20th century Marxists, or I don't know if they were like, is Benjamin a Marxist?
Oh, definitely he is.
Right? I think so. Like a lot of people are going, no, he's not. He's a holder there. And no, I think he's a Marxist in his reading of culture. But I think he really takes seriously that that a 19th century drape could contain within this bullshit thing, the entire history of 19th century bourgeois culture. Or like Adorno's reading of the peephole. I mean, like there are these ways that you can take like technologies and bits of shit from the modern era, and I think extrapolate or find within them like these crystallized, I don't know what to call them, excesses, remainders. But the Marxist tradition, I think, is the only one to take that thought seriously. And I so wish that Lacan had continued on that way. I mean, I guess we should turn it over. I shouldn't keep going because
no, this is something we should continue to discuss. You've literally hit the point that is the maximal point of interest and curiosity that keeps me returning and returning and returning to Lacan. But maybe we could go to, Andrew and Jordan and Louise.
Yes, thank you all for your patience. While Daniel and I just nerd out for a minute.
No,
maybe we should do a podcast, Sam, where we just like nerd out on these questions.
Well, anytime, man, holler at me. I'll give you my cell. You just call me anytime and we'll just start.
Well, this was the joke that I made. It was like history repeats itself, and it's like you're Lacan and we're the Althusserians bringing you in, But
Althusser he was so promising. The best thing that came from Althusser is Rancière.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I think that Rancière's work in the reading capital is really fruitful. I've been nerding out.
What a great Marxist. Rancière is a great Marxist in my view.
And
I just interviewed him yesterday for the podcast that we're doing right now, Emancipation.
He's still alive.
That man's old.
He's not only is he still alive, he has a forthcoming book on Chekhov, which sounds amazing, and 2 books on art. I would say he's thriving.
Go figure. You know, we should all be so lucky when we reach the ripe old age of 116, which is almost certainly what Jacques Rancière is. I love him. Fabulous. Yeah.
But I was just gonna say, I think like a good book that really, before I get into my point, regarding the discourse, a good book. I think I mentioned it before in one of the reading groups. Sam is the Leon Rosichner's text on Freud and the limits of bourgeois individualism, which Daniel put me on, and that's been my Bible for Freudian Marxism.
That's a great title.
Which it's not that, they go hand in glove. It's not a marriage, but it's that they get at the point of like two different versions of an antagonism and power and subjugation, etc. But my question, comment and question regarding the discourses, and particularly the way that you mapped out the particular function of S1 and oneness, something like the oneness, something like the one, in all of these discourses, I think was really helpful and vital and kind of contributes to what I want to ask, because it's about impasse. Let's get back to mathematics. Let's get back to the logical mathematics or mathematical logic. And you said it, that what Lacan is doing with these mathematical devices, these math themes, is to formulate an impasse, something in the real. Now, I think, and my question is, don't you think that the master's discourse itself is the first impasse? The reason being is because if you go back to seminar 16, gives us the three-legged animal to illustrate the signifier represents the subject for another signifier, right? But he only gives us that on page 13 or 14, I think. And then in the next chapter on the inconsistency of the other, he maps out the ordered pairs, which would be just the basic elementary definition of a signifier represents a subject to another signifier. Any signifier given, big S, relates to another signifier, big A, and big A is the battery bank of all signifiers. But the thing is that once you map that out, we get into the Russell's paradox, because A is all members of a set that do not contain themselves. S is the set for all sets or members that do not contain themselves. And then you just get up in this ad infinitum. And so it's the problem of oneness and completeness, of containment.
Yes, it is.
And
that
so
is the core problem in Lacanian theory.
And so isn't it interesting? That's the whole thematic of the seminar, including the inconsistency and incompleteness of the other, a la Pascal and Descartes, the absolutization of the market, yada, yada, yada. But it's interesting in the beginning of seminar 17, where he's like, last year we went over these, devices. Today, I'm going to draw S1 and S2. Congratulations, we changed our notations. But no, the whole thing is that what he's getting at is that we've went over from one impasse of S and A to a new formalization of that impasse, a la S1 and S2 barred S and A, to exemplify the fact that we are accounting for the Russell's paradox, which is the unconscious, onto the master's discourse, right?
I'd say you're getting right after it.
This is a new impasse, particularly to formulate the prior impasse. And these keep going on to account for the original, that there is no one.
Okay, so here's a great project. Somebody should do this for their dissertation, or at least a master's thesis. Trace all of Lacan's formulations for impasse. Discourse, I think, is the culmination. It's where, let me rephrase. It's the big breakthrough. It's the big breakthrough. I don't think it's the culmination. I think actually what he's doing with sexuation is a little closer to something like that. Here, and what he'll tell you is it's actually just a wind of string, a ring of string. I mean, that's going to be for him. That's the truth of writing, if you think about it. The written word that you see right here is just, all this is a knot that's been flattened. Writing is just a flattening of knots. And every letter that you see up here performs that same function. This is just a flattening of a three-dimensional period where you have something that goes in front and something that is now behind. The writing, the act of writing. I think all of that is terribly relevant here. But I think a great master's thesis would be going through and just talking about all the different ways that Lacan signified the fact that the other is lacking.
Yeah.
And
that's
also,
really what we're
also
talking
that is Lacan versus Derrida as well, by the way, just as a, because I feel like a lot of Lacanians sometimes forget how much those debates of grammatology actually are propelling Lacan along, especially when we get to on a discourse that might not be semblant, where Derrida comes back big time, by the way.
Yeah, what Lacan always would say, I think it's even in that seminar as well, that Derrida stole his little a
Right.
in
So
different
Sam,
ones, right? He's like, you stole my little a, motherfucker. You took it at John Hopkins.
so Sam, my last point being with this impasse of formalization, which would be, you know, the impossibility of completeness, or like the other, you know, the incompleteness of the other.
Yeah.
Would it be correct to say that that is sort of repeating in the analyst discourse with the function of S1 as the not only master signifier that's being produced, but the einzige Zug, the unary trait, which is always a count, a cut, or what Lorenzo Chiesa would say is the unary trait is nothing more than just that. It's just a mark. So the repetition of something like the one, which is a count of the one, but not the one, that we get from this primordial S to A that is impossible, that is being repeated in these S1s that are produced in the analyst discourse.
Maybe. I think it's a little more complicated than that, though. The symptom for Lacan is a statement. It's what he calls the D, or the said, DIT. What matters for him in terms of getting us back to that unary trait, the mark of castration, is, I think, instead tracing every said back to an act of saying, an embodied act and fact of saying. In order for something to have been said, I must first open my mouth and actively say something. And Lacan thinks that those acts of saying are prior to the production of any said. The reason why I say it's more complex than that is that the said, as you can see here, refers back to a whole field, what Lacan calls a dimension, DIT mention, of the unconscious. We are still squarely in the realm of language when we're dealing with this S1. That brings us to the threshold of the unary trait, and beyond it, the real. But it does not put us there. The act and fact of saying that preceded the production of a symptomatic statement does, because it doesn't refer back to the unconscious as a linguistic field. It refers back to the unconscious's big sister, which is exactly how Lacan understands the real. The real is truth's big sister, or as I put it in our series on L'étourdi, the sensei. This is the older teacher who's been there and done that. The truth is just a little sister that the real bosses around. That's why if you wanted to really push this, you might have a dotted, curvy, weird line pointing from access to the real to a field of truth that is still fundamentally linguistic. And you can ask, where would you locate the unary trait here? The unary trait might be somewhere between the real and the truth, between the impossible and the unconscious. But that's a spot that you can designate by focusing not on what's said, but on the act of saying. And like I said, it's more complex. So I'm sorry to do this, because I know it's like, is this kind of some weird shit to say? But this is where Lacan is as he's trying to think through like the next stage of the unary trait as a mark of castration. Because ultimately, I think for Lacan, in analysis, it comes back to castration. This is fundamentally the position from which you want the analysand to speak if they're neurotic. And it's also the point at which you want them to arrive, ultimately, at an embrace of castration. Some people call it this subjective destitution thing you heard me figure. I don't know that I find that very useful. But this idea of the analyst holding a place for the real, and Lacan puts it very well in L'étourdi. He says the analyst holds a place for the real, but just until something better comes along. The better that comes along is the analysand, when they finally talk themselves into their own castration. And now they hold the place for the real. They are the placeholder. And I think that is the next level at this stage, like the advanced thinking around the unary trait. Yeah. Maybe it's also why Lacan was fascinated with tattoos, kind of marking of the body, the inscribare of the body.
Should we go to Jordan next?
Jordan, what's going on?
That was a
Hi,
great
Sam.
question,
Can you hear me?
Andrew.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, I just had a question. In terms of analytic experience, the analysand kind of, or the masters and hysterics discourses kind of, the analysand speech kind of occupies the position of agency in the masters and hysterics discourse in analytic experience, whereas in the analysts and university discourses, the analyst's speech is occupying the agential position. Is that an accurate kind of reading of that?
Oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of it across those. Jordan, will you say it one more time? I want to really study these diagrams as you're speaking so I can try and answer that
Yes.
question. It's great.
So in the master's discourse in analytic experience, the analysand comes and addresses the analyst like, "Hey, I need you're the doctor, you are the knowledge, I need you to fix me." And then throughout analysis becomes hystericized and allows their split subjectivity to occupy that position of agency, addressing the analyst as a kind of like master of I'm not sure. I don't have that completely down. But with the analyst discourse, the analyst's sort of abjection or like nonchalance occupies that position of agency and kind of allows the analysand split subjectivity to become. So the analysand is no longer addressing an other, but kind of allowing the lack of the analyst to produce like S1s as symptoms or avatars of split subjectivity for the analysand or for the analyst to enjoy, I guess.
Got it.
And with the analyst's discourse or the university discourse, sorry, is kind of the false progress or like the misstep of the analyst where they allow their knowledge to sort of take the role of agent.
That's great.
My question is sort of the end of analysis or the final horizon of analysis, is that when the analyst is no longer needed because because the analysand is able to put their own objet in the position of agent and address their own split subjectivity and produce their own sort of avatars of split subjectivity for them to enjoy in. Is that kind of, I don't know, is that an accurate reading, do you think?
First of all, weirdly, and I do not say this lightly, but yes, Lacan would say that that is the accurate reading. And I don't say it lightly because it's kind of a weirdly contentious conclusion. Because if you follow this out, it means that the only analysand who has completed their analysis is the analysand who has become an analyst. Think about this. What you're basically saying is that the analysand at the end of analysis could occupy the analytic discourse and assume as their own semblance of agency that little a. That lines up with what Lacan has been saying from seminar 11 forward. That the only people that complete analysis are analysts. I find that just a very weird and provocative position. And maybe he has to invent the pass in order to provide a little extra something, because otherwise just completing an analysis would make you an analyst. So I think, Jordan, that what you just articulated is an extremely true and extremely dangerous conclusion to Lacan's own thought. I think that's really important. This guy, there's a lot that we could say about.
Why did you say dangerous, if you don't mind me asking?
think it's dangerous because it suggests that analysis is just for those who want to go on to become analysts. It creates, I don't think that's useful. I'm not saying everybody needs to be in psychoanalysis, but I much prefer a democratized psychoanalysis. Like, for instance, in lectures on Lacan, there are clinicians, there are students, trainees, professors, all kind of people fucking show up. But I love it that not all of the clinicians and the trainees that show up are Lacanian. They just know that there's something cool that Lacan is doing that maybe they could use in their own clinical work. And they in turn bring whatever school they came from, they bring that tradition into the conversation. I like a looser, less elitist, less narrow path for psychoanalysis. For instance, I think you can do psychoanalysis on a bus. I think psychoanalysis is what happens when someone shows up as an analysand, no matter where you are. I guess I'm just kind of like, I'm really skeptical about anything that would make an already very expensive and very long and onerous therapeutic technique even more elitist. So I really appreciate what my friend Thomas Marchevsky has done with the clinic without walls. This is the guy who hops in the bus and drives to the street corner. Because it suggests to me that there's a more radical democratic reading of psychoanalysis.
I always like to remind folks that every member of Freud's inner circle, all of Freud's main disciples, existed in a kind of democratic socialist milieu of Vienna in which they themselves received free analysis. And then, of course, there's Freud's free clinics, right, which Freud celebrated. And one other thing, Sam, you may or may not be aware, a good friend of our program, Gabriel Tupanamba, he's a Brazilian-based Lacanian, and he has written a book called The Desire of Psychoanalysis, and there's 2 chapters in there, you may be familiar with it, about how to democratize and make more egalitarian Lacanian psychoanalysis, which, of course, we were recently at the conference that Derek Hook put on at Duquesne, and somebody gave the number of Lacanian practitioners, like American individuals that are in Lacanian psychoanalysis. And I was astonished at how low the number was. And the reason is, I mean, it's like something like 2,000 range, 3,000 range, something like that. And I think the reason that it's so low has to do with the fact that most they don't take the insurance, right? It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward.
And why should they? Why should they? Because, I mean, just think about this in terms of when I told you the primary resistance in analysis is that of the analyst. This all fits perfectly into the analyst who can't wait to get to their office and nail their fucking diplomas on the wall, who loves the fact that sitting on the shelf behind every analysand are all the Lacan books that they read. I had a great analyst. I don't know what her training was, and I refused to look into it any further. I think she was Lacanian, I don't know. But I was always disturbed that she had Freud's complete works in German on her shelf. And I was just like, how fucking pretentious are you?
I put all my Lacan books off to the side. Everything behind me is like...
I keep mine in one of those large wheelie trash cans with the lid that pops open. And then I just shake it out every now and again. Mine are shredded. I mean, you know how many copies of Seminar 20? I'm on my 3rd copy of Seminar 20 at this point. I read them till they fall apart, until they become worthless, until they can't be read anymore.
Right.
I mean, like, so check out my latest copy of Seminar 20 from the last series. Oh no, wait, that's somebody else's copy. My latest copy, like, I don't think I could go through and like read this thing again. It's too fucking marked and marred with my own garbage.
Right.
Do you see what I'm saying? So this book is now officially trash. I can't use it anymore. Okay, that's weird. That's weird and long, but
okay, shall we go to Luis for a final
Luis, floor is yours. Final word, my man.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what you're talking about. Like, I wonder, is the appearance of mastery nonetheless necessary? Right? You said that the analyst becoming to the university discourse, right, is bad. But what about the analysand becoming, after analysis, getting knowledge and becoming part of this university discourse, right? It's not,
Yes.
don't you think that's a necessary step nonetheless? That's why maybe analysts need to go to analysis again, right? To get of this, mastery, right? Get rid of this mastery, but nonetheless it's necessary, right? If not, why would you pick this analyst if you don't know that this analyst is nonetheless master, right? Do you think that it's
Oh,
necessary
that's
to
so
have this
good.
mastery?
Okay, so Louise, let me just try and track this for a minute. This may be the thread that stitches it all together. Here's the analysand who shows up at analysis saying, fixed me. What they get instead is hystericized. Let's not talk about where you feel whole and won. Let's talk instead from the position of your truth as a barred subject. The analysand as master gets hystericized. And if Jordan's conclusion is as true as I think it is, this would in turn produce a recipe for training. Here is the analysand complete from analysis and now going to get their fancy doctoral degree in Lacanian blah, blah, blah. And they would learn through this process that part of what it means to do their job well is to let go of knowledge. And here you've got the full circuit run. Analysand at the start, analysand underway, analysand complete, and analysand turned analyst. I love what you've just done here, Louise. You've showed us that at the start of analysis, the neurotic plays master. At its peak, they are hystericized. At its end, they're ready to proceed into the university discourse. But that, if it's done well in the sense of producing an analyst, would give way to another discourse in which knowledge no longer is the driving force, but abjection instead. I actually love this as a system. Well done.
I was thinking more about like a revolution, right? You go master, historic, analyst, university, and then you go again, master, historic, analyst. But then what is it inevitable to go against to university? Because in Lacan 17, what we read in 16, because that science creates the psychoanalyst subject, right? Because of the alienation from truth, right? This is, I think, pretty much what is happening in the university discourse, right? This S1, right, is being of being one, right, is being alienated, right? So this is nonetheless necessary to have this institution, let's say like the psychoanalytic institution, right? To analysis work without the institution. That would be a good question.
Yes, it does and it should. And I think when you read Lacan carefully, he says there's only one psychoanalytic group. And that group is the group formed between the analyst and the analysand. He does not have any faith in institutions. And in fact, he thinks that's contradictory to what, I mean, this is a more extreme statement that he comes up with in the early 1970s, that the only group of psychoanalysis, the only institution of psychoanalysis is that which is established in discourse between analyst and analysand. But, we didn't really talk much about the university discourse. I think there's a really just easy way to understand this, and it kind of takes what you've done with alienation and flips it for a second. The professor as S2 is the alienated subject. And the S1 from which they are alienated is the master's discourse, is power. So for instance, I mean, all of your professors are paid just enough to know that when rocks go flying through windows, a property owner has to repair those windows. This is part of the secret, is you have to keep your intellectuals fed just well enough and just propertied enough that they wouldn't dare pick up a rock and throw it. And that's what the university discourse shows. On the left-hand side of that discourse, you see a knower, the professor, ignorant of the truth atop which their professions occur. And the truth here is that of power, that of the master. The master is always the puppeteer. And the university discourse is always that of the puppet. The professor is the puppet for power. And on the right-hand side, you basically just see the student. The professor addresses the curiosity and intrigue of the students. There's objet A. And unfortunately, uses that to produce feelings of inadequacy. Oh, I'll never be as smart as them. Oh, I'll never be as read as them. And that is precisely what the bad professor gets off on. A series of lacking subjects that then can occupy a worshipful relation to the big other here as S2, all-knowing, omniscient, relative to their lack of knowledge, their barred subjectivity. I mean, that's the dilemma of surplus enjoyment for the professoriate, is that they address curiosity, but do it in a way that demeans, and then wind up getting off on the subordinate, lacking state of students. And this is exactly what has ailed the entire Lacanian tradition in the Anglophone world, is you have a bunch of people who use fancy words, trying to make things sound more complicated than they are, and leaving the rest of us just feeling stupid. I was so pissed at these Lacanians when I was coming up that I was like, fuck you guys, I'm going to read Hegel. And that was how I started. I read the Phenomenology in spite of all the Lacanians with their S1s and their S2s and their objas. And I just knew back then, I was like, you guys are full of shit. You're using all these buzzwords. You have no fucking idea what you're talking about. And it turns out to be true. Most of the people that want to talk about Lacan have not done the work. They don't, there's just no way around it.
I've always thought that the reflections that Lacanian commentators have on the university discourse, when we might propose it as enlarged to also be inclusive of power relations within a bureaucracy, to be quite interesting.
That's great. Yeah.
Right.
I love that enlarged state. Yeah.
I like it too. Yeah. Like, because this is like Miller's point that he likes to repeat and repeat and repeat, which is, what was Lacan talking about in 16 before he invents university discourse? He was talking about the bureaucratic stultification of Stalinism as the precondition, or one of the preconditions, for the stultification of Marxist knowledge. Right? So the knowledge of Marxism made every agent within the discourse of Marxism into a dupe. In other words, it didn't resolve all that it did. It was almost kind of narcissistic. It almost it put forward a disjunct between the discourse's capacity to speak to the split subjectivity of the real working class. It just used slogans, right? And that it relied on religiously, because it also, the university discourse of a bureaucracy is like a religious discourse.
Yeah, you bet it is.
And that's also why I think Eric Laurent says that its origin came about in the time of Charlemagne, when Charlemagne took the court and fused it with the scholars. So the university discourse was a scandal in the history of knowledge production, because it almost like led to the industrial production of knowledge, whereby before, the ascetic or the saint had a knowledge that didn't rely on this automatic generation of knowledge. And I think the other important point that I always like to stress here is the example of Diderot, where Lacan says the most important text of Diderot is not the encyclopedia, Diderot being the founder of the Enlightenment, but it's his text Rameau's Nephew, which is a text about how the discourse of the university cannot resolve, and I think every professor knows this, cannot resolve not the ignorant subject, but the student who desires the knowledge that's transmitted in the classroom to actually address their split subjectivity. University discourse.
God, that's tragic, man.
You know what I mean, though?
Yeah, I do. I get it.
All that you can do is make a scholar.
Yeah.
And then they make a name for themselves as the product.
Oh
What's the
God.
product? Look at the
Yeah.
product.
Yeah.
That's the product is you, the name of the scholar.
Yeah.
That's the
Isn't
product.
that fucking wild?
That's the product. That's crazy, right?
I know. I know. And
That's
that's
crazy.
why I think your move into sainthood
Yeah.
is really an important move here. The
I got to think about that more. You've given us a lot
derelict,
to think about.
fucked up, trashy toss saint. That's what
Right.
we want. And that's also why I queue up Rancière. Because I mean, what
Yes.
Rancière knows is that the best teacher is an ignorant one, right? Rancière knows that the
Exactly.
best
Exactly.
schoolmaster is an ignorant one.
Right.
I mean, you want to see the best teacher at work? Let me try and teach you Mandarin. I don't fucking know Mandarin. That means it's going to be the best class you ever took. You know what I mean? And that's why I always emphasize this. Whatever I'm talking about in this session or beyond, this is stuff that I'm actively trying to figure out. That's why
Right.
I queue up television, because I just started reading it yesterday. It's just on my mind. So I wish sainthood for all of you.
You got to read television, but then watch the video of Lacan delivering it.
Dude,
And
I
the
can't
body
even
language.
believe this.
The
Yeah,
body language.
yeah,
Oh my God, the
yes.
body language. It's like
I know.
it's like a whole thing you could interpret along with it.
Yeah, so I took the transcript of the interview
Yeah.
and I just translated it into English because I don't mind this rewriting that we have of this text, and I look forward to reading it with everybody. But I'm way more interested in the transcriptions,
Mm.
what is said in the actual interview. And the reason why is because Miller just sounds like such an idiot, and I just love that. But here, if we presume that in this rewritten version, we've got Miller saying things like, "I think, my dear doctor, that I am here not to trade witticisms with you," blah, 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 blah. What Miller actually says in the interview is the unconscious. What a strange word. That's his intervention. So anyway, there's the fabrication, the name, the production, the
Right.
commodity to
Right.
Daniel's
Right.
point.
Right.
And then there's the actual delivery of this shit.
Right.
I love that distinction. I'm going to try and preserve that in the series. I mean,
Yeah.
wish me luck.
No, I mean it's a very inadequate production, right? Which is like, yeah, all we can really give you is the gift of your own self-invention and to build your name, right?
Yeah.
Which then means that, and Miller has mentioned this himself, that when capitalism latches onto the university discourse, it's not a contradictory latching on, because you can see the logic of the commodity, the roulette, and the name of the brand of the scholar, right?
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Right. Anyways,
Oh, and
shall
even
we?
too, in the university and capitalist, you see the S1s overlapping, that being their very point in the structure.
Oh,
where they
wow, there you go. There you
That was
go.
all you, dude. That was all you. I'll cite
No,
you.
this so much. This is so rich, Sam. It's
Hey,
extremely rich.
this has been so much fun. What a blast. What a great crew you have here.
Oh man, we got to get you back on. This is so much fun. I don't know if
You
anybody
follow
wanted
it
to jump in
anytime.
with a final thought. I'll just leave it open, and if not, we will reconvene
No,
hopefully
good.
sometime. When do you start the television session with your group?
In January.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's a mini series, and then we're gonna get right into that non-dupe that errors.
Mm,
We're gonna do 21 in the spring. But this winter, I thought we'd do television because it kind of occurs more or less as 21 is getting started.
okay.
And so yeah. So yeah, we're gonna do television in January, and then probably in February, I'll start seminar 21.
Wow.
Yeah, that'll be fun. I just want to come up with a better translation for that title. Le nom du père. What do we call that? Is that Andrew? Is that the unary trait?
Yeah.
The no of the father? I love it, hasn't it? We're gonna get to the bottom of it if I can. Anyway, I'm excited, and I gotta say that you're out here doing this, Daniel, is such a great inspiration. This is actually what I think the university should be.
Right.
You are doing the work of being a real professor. This is what it looks like, my friends. If you didn't notice, if you didn't know, this is what it actually looks like. It's when you just show up on a Sunday to chop it up for 3 hours. That's the
I
real
know, and the
work.
time absolutely flew by, and
Oh boy.
I'm now energized, and I'm gonna face the holiday seasons with a lighter step. You've given us a great gift. You know, this is really
Yeah.
so much to sink our teeth into, and the more clarity we have about the impasse, and again the delta as the variable that allows us to see the relationship between the product and the underlying truth, I will that is amazing, man. Thank you very much for that, by the way.
That's
I
so
wanted to
sweet
say
of
that
you to
again.
say. And as long as you remember that every gift is a gift of shit, I'll also go into the holidays knowing that we're all sinking our teeth into the same turd. Trashitas, not Trashitas, not caritas. All right, y'all.
All
Thanks,
the best,
Sam.
everyone.
Thanks so much. Nice
Thanks,
talking.
Daniel.
Happy
Bye.
holidays, everyone.
Happy
Take care.
holidays.